Welcome, true believers, to a journey through the darkest corners of the Marvel Universe. Tonight, we explore the twisted mirrors of our greatest heroes, the evil variants, corrupted counterparts, and fallen champions who remind us that even the noblest hearts can be consumed by darkness. From alternate dimensions where circumstances shaped different choices, to our own heroes transformed by cosmic forces and moral failures. These are the stories that show us how thin the line truly is between salvation and damnation. So settle in, let the darkness embrace you, and drift into tales of heroes lost to shadow and shadow made manifest. In the beginning, there was Reed Richards, the man who would become Mr. Fantastic, stretching the boundaries of human knowledge as easily as he could stretch his own molecular structure. He was the dreamer who looked at the stars and saw not distant lights, but destinations waiting to be explored. He was the scientist who believed that every problem in the universe could be solved through the careful application of intelligence, research, and unwavering determination. Reed Richards represented the very best of human potential, the marriage of brilliant intellect with noble purpose, the fusion of curiosity with compassion. But in the infinite expanse of the multiverse, there exists another Reed Richards, one whose story began much the same way but took a path so dark and twisted that it serves as a haunting reminder of how easily genius can become monstrosity. This is the story of the Maker, the Reed Richards of Earth 1610, the Ultimate Universe, where the same cosmic rays that granted fantastic powers also set in motion a chain of events that would transform one of science's greatest champions into one of its most terrifying villains. The Reed Richards of the Ultimate Universe began his journey with the same passionate curiosity that drove his mainstream counterpart. He was a young man obsessed with the mysteries of space and time, convinced that humanity's destiny lay among the stars. Like his other dimensional twin, he built an experimental spacecraft designed to break the barriers between Earth and the cosmos beyond. Like his counterpart, he was impatient with government oversight and safety protocols, driven by a vision that seemed to demand immediate action regardless of potential consequences. The accident that gave him his powers was identical in its cosmic scope and transformative effects. The cosmic rays that bombarded his ship rewrote the fundamental structure of his cellular makeup, granting him the ability to stretch and reshape his body at will. Alongside his companions, Sue Storm, Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm, he became one of the Ultimate Universe's premier heroes, using his newfound abilities and scientific genius to protect a world that desperately needed protection. For a time, this Reed Richards walked the same heroic path as his mainstream counterpart. He led the Ultimate Fantastic Four through adventures that spanned dimensions and challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. He fell in love with Sue Storm, watched over Johnny like a younger brother, and maintained a friendship with Ben Grimm despite the tragic transformation that had turned his old college roommate into a creature of living rock. He was, by every measure that mattered, a hero. But the Ultimate Universe was a harsher place than the mainstream Marvel reality, a world where good intentions more often led to tragic consequences than triumphant victories. The heroes of this reality faced challenges that were more brutal, more personal, and more psychologically devastating than their counterparts in other dimensions. The weight of constant crisis, the burden of impossible choices, and the gradual erosion of hope began to take their toll on even the strongest minds and the noblest hearts. The first crack in Reed's heroic facade appeared during the Ultimate Universe's encounter with Galactus, the world-devouring cosmic entity whose hunger threatened to consume entire civilizations. Where the mainstream Reed Richards had faced Galactus and found a way to save both Earth and preserve the cosmic balance, the Ultimate Reed watched helplessly as billions died across the galaxy. The experience of witnessing destruction on such an unimaginable scale of seeing entire worlds reduced to lifeless husks to feed an entity's endless appetite, planted seeds of doubt in Reed's mind about the fundamental nature of existence itself. These doubts were nurtured by personal betrayals that cut deeper than any cosmic threat. Reed discovered that Sue Storm, the woman he loved more than life itself, had been secretly involved with his friend Ben Grimm before the accident that transformed them all. The revelation that his closest companions had been keeping secrets from him, that the relationships he had cherished were built on foundations of deception and hidden truths, shattered his faith in human connection and trust. But perhaps most damaging of all was Reed's growing awareness of humanity's reaction to his efforts to help them. Despite his sacrifices, despite his dedication to protecting a world that feared and misunderstood him, Reed began to see that people were incapable of appreciating the scope of his vision. They complained about the disruption his experiments caused to their daily lives. They questioned his methods, even when those methods saved millions of lives. They looked at his stretching abilities with disgust rather than wonder, seeing him as a freak rather than a miracle of science. The transformation from hero to villain didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a slow erosion of idealism that took place over months and years. Reed began to distance himself from his teammates, spending more and more time alone in his laboratory, pursuing research that became increasingly esoteric and morally questionable. He started to view other people not as individuals worthy of protection, but as variables in an equation that needed to be solved, as components in a system that required optimization. The breaking point came when Reed realized that the fundamental problem wasn't any external threat to humanity, but humanity itself. People, he concluded, were inherently flawed creatures, driven by emotion rather than logic, motivated by self-interest rather than the greater good. They made decisions based on fear and prejudice rather than evidence and reason. They rejected solutions that could improve their lives simply because they didn't understand the science behind them. In Reed's increasingly twisted worldview, humanity's greatest enemy wasn't some cosmic force or interdimensional threat, it was their own nature. This realization led Reed to perhaps the most chilling conclusion in the history of superhero comics, that the only way to create a perfect future was to remove human choice from the equation entirely. If people couldn't be trusted to make the right decisions, then someone with superior intelligence and vision would have to make those decisions for them. If humanity couldn't evolve naturally toward a better state of being, then they would have to be forced to evolve through scientific intervention and genetic manipulation. The moment Reed Richards embraced this philosophy was the moment he ceased to be a hero and became the maker. He faked his own death in a carefully orchestrated explosion, allowing the world to believe that the brilliant but sometimes troublesome scientist had finally paid the ultimate price for his dangerous experiments. In reality, Reed had simply shed his old identity like a snake sheds its skin, emerging from the wreckage of his former life as something entirely new and infinitely more dangerous. The visual transformation was as dramatic as the psychological one. Where Reed Richards had worn the simple blue uniform of the Fantastic Four, the Maker draped himself in flowing robes that concealed his true form and intentions. Most striking of all was his helmet, an elongated metallic mask that covered his entire head and extended upward like a twisted crown. The helmet served multiple purposes. It protected his identity. It enhanced his intellectual capabilities through built-in computational systems, and it created a barrier between himself and the humanity he had come to despise. The helmet was more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of Reed's complete rejection of human connection and emotion. By hiding his face behind an expressionless metal mask, he was declaring that he had moved beyond such petty concerns as personal relationships and emotional bonds. He was no longer Reed Richards, a man with hopes and fears and desires like any other. He was the Maker, a being of pure intellect and unwavering purpose, dedicated to reshaping reality according to his vision of perfection. The Maker's first acts as a villain were calculated to demonstrate the futility of heroic resistance to his plans. He began by infiltrating the very organizations and institutions that had once relied on Reed Richards for protection and guidance. Using his intimate knowledge of superhero psychology and tactics, he manipulated events from behind the scenes, turning heroes against each other and creating crises that seemed to require increasingly authoritarian solutions. His approach to villainy was unlike anything the Ultimate Universe had seen before. Where other villains relied on brute force or emotional manipulation, the Maker employed pure scientific method in service of utterly immoral goals. He didn't destroy cities in fits of rage or conquer nations through military might. Instead, he conducted careful experiments on entire populations, treating human beings like laboratory subjects in studies designed to determine the most efficient methods of control and compliance. The biological weapons he created were marvels of scientific achievement and monuments to moral bankruptcy. He designed viruses that could rewrite human DNA to make people more docile and compliant. He developed neural implants that could override free will while leaving the subject convinced they were acting according to their own desires. He created entire species of genetically modified creatures, each one perfectly adapted for a specific role in his vision of an ordered society. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the Maker's complete lack of emotional investment in his crimes. He didn't torture people because he enjoyed their suffering. He tortured them because pain was an effective motivational tool. He didn't kill because he was angry. He killed because certain individuals represented inefficiencies in his grand design that needed to be eliminated. His detached clinical approach to human suffering made him more terrifying than any raging monster or cackling madman. The Maker's ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete restructuring of reality itself. Using his advanced understanding of interdimensional physics and cosmic forces, he began working on technologies that could rewrite the fundamental laws of nature on a multiversal scale. He envisioned a cosmos where every variable was controlled, where every outcome was predetermined, where suffering and chaos were eliminated through the simple expedient of removing choice and unpredictability from existence. His plans were so vast in scope and so methodically executed that even his former teammates in the Fantastic Four struggled to comprehend what they were facing. This wasn't just Reed Richards having a breakdown or being influenced by some external force. This was their friend and leader, revealing that he had always possessed the capacity for this level of evil, that his heroic actions had perhaps been motivated more by a desire for control than by genuine compassion. The psychological impact on Sue Storm, Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm was devastating. They had trusted Reed completely, had followed his leadership without question, had believed that his scientific genius was matched by moral wisdom. To discover that the man they had loved and respected was capable of such calculated cruelty forced them to question everything they thought they knew about heroism, friendship, and the nature of good and evil. When the Ultimate Universe finally collapsed during the events of Secret Wars in 2015, the Maker was one of the few beings powerful enough and resourceful enough to survive the transition to a new reality. He found himself transplanted to Earth 616, the mainstream Marvel universe, where he encountered a version of Reed Richards who had made all the choices he had rejected, who had chosen family over control, love over logic, hope over despair. The contrast between the two Reed Richards became one of the most philosophically rich conflicts in modern Marvel comics. The mainstream Reed represented the path not taken, the proof that genius and power could be wielded responsibly and compassionately. The Maker saw his heroic counterpart as a weakling who had squandered his potential, who had allowed sentiment and emotion to prevent him from achieving true greatness. Each viewed the other as a cautionary tale, Reed seeing what he could become if he lost his moral compass, the Maker seeing what he had been before he gained true clarity of purpose. The Maker's presence in the mainstream Marvel universe served as a constant reminder that heroism is not inevitable, that good intentions are not sufficient to guarantee good outcomes, and that the same qualities that make someone capable of great good also make them capable of great evil. His very existence challenged other heroes to examine their own motivations and methods, to consider whether they were truly acting in humanity's best interests or simply imposing their own vision of right and wrong on a world that hadn't asked for their intervention. In the end, the Maker represents one of Marvel's most sophisticated explorations of moral philosophy and the nature of heroism. He is not a villain who was corrupted by external forces or driven mad by tragedy. He is a hero who made a series of rational, logical decisions that led him step by step away from everything he once claimed to believe in. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked intelligence, the seductive appeal of absolute solutions to complex problems, and the ease with which good intentions can be perverted into justifications for unspeakable evil. The Reed Richards, who became the Maker, believed he was saving the universe. He believed he was using his gifts to create a better world for everyone. He believed that his superior intellect gave him not just the ability, but the moral obligation to make decisions for lesser beings who couldn't understand the bigger picture. In his own mind, he remained the hero of his story, right up until the moment he became everyone else's nightmare. And perhaps that is the most chilling aspect of the Maker's character, not that he became evil, but that he became evil while genuinely believing he remained good. He shows us that the road to hell is not just paved with good intentions, but that sometimes the most dangerous villains are those who never stop believing they are heroes, who never question whether their vision of perfection might actually be someone else's vision of hell. There has never been a more dangerous combination in the Marvel universe than genius-level intellect paired with unlimited resources and an ego large enough to encompass entire solar systems. Tony Stark, the man who became Iron Man, represents the pinnacle of human achievement in technology, innovation, and strategic thinking. He is the futurist who sees solutions where others see only problems, the inventor whose creations have saved the world countless times, the philanthropist whose wealth has been transformed into a force for global good. But within that same brilliant mind lies the potential for something far more sinister, something that emerged fully formed during one of Marvel's most disturbing alternate reality scenarios. Superior Iron Man is not a visitor from another dimension or a creation of cosmic forces beyond human understanding. He is Tony Stark himself, the same genius billionaire philanthropist that readers have followed for decades, but with all his moral restraints removed and his worst impulses given free rein to flourish. This is the Tony Stark who no longer sees other people as individuals worthy of protection and respect, but as resources to be managed, problems to be solved, or obstacles to be overcome in his relentless pursuit of a perfect world shaped entirely according to his vision. The transformation began during the events known as Axis, when a spell cast by the Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom inverted the moral alignments of heroes and villains across the Marvel universe. Heroes became villains, villains became heroes, and the fundamental nature of good and evil was turned upside down in a cosmic game of moral musical chairs. For most of the affected characters, this inversion was clearly artificial, a magical compulsion that forced them to act against their true nature in ways that felt obviously wrong and alien. But Tony Stark was different. When the inversion spell took hold of his psyche, it didn't create a completely foreign personality or force him to act in ways that contradicted his essential nature. Instead, it simply removed the ethical boundaries and moral considerations that had always served as checks on his natural tendencies toward arrogance, control, and self-aggrandizement. The spell didn't make Tony evil so much as it made him honest about impulses and desires he had always possessed but had learned to suppress in service of being a hero. The result was perhaps the most terrifying villain Marvel had ever created, precisely because he felt so familiar and believable. This wasn't some cackling madman or cosmic entity driven by incomprehensible motivations. This was Tony Stark, recognizably himself in every way except for his complete abandonment of any concern for the welfare of others. He retained his wit, his charm, his incredible intelligence, and his technological prowess. He simply no longer felt any obligation to use these gifts for anyone's benefit but his own. Superior Iron Man's first act upon embracing his inverted nature was to relocate to San Francisco, a city he chose specifically because it represented the cutting edge of technological innovation and social progress. If he was going to reshape the world according to his vision, he reasoned, he might as well start with a population that was already predisposed to embrace technological solutions to human problems. San Francisco became his laboratory, and its citizens became his test subjects in an experiment designed to determine the most effective methods of social control through technological dependency. The centerpiece of his plan was Extremis 3.0, an advanced nanotechnology application that represented the ultimate fusion of Tony's technological genius with his newfound moral flexibility. Extremis had always been one of Stark's most ambitious and dangerous inventions, a virus-like nanotechnology that could rewrite human biology at the cellular level, granting enhanced strength, speed, durability, and healing capabilities to anyone who received the treatment. Previous versions of Extremis had been plagued by instability and ethical concerns about the permanent alteration of human physiology. Superior Iron Man's version solved the stability problems while completely ignoring the ethical ones. Extremis 3.0 could grant users perfect health, ideal physical appearance, enhanced cognitive function, and even limited superhuman abilities. It was, in every sense, a miracle cure for the human condition, a technological solution to aging, disease, disability, and even death itself. Users could literally become perfect versions of themselves, freed from all the physical and mental limitations that had constrained human potential since the dawn of civilization. But Tony's genius wasn't just technological, it was also psychological and economic. He understood that simply giving away such incredible power would make people suspicious and ungrateful. Instead, he designed Extremis 3.0 as a subscription service, a daily dose of perfection that required constant renewal to maintain its effects. Users who stopped taking their daily Extremis treatment would gradually revert to their original, unenhanced state, losing all the benefits they had come to depend on. The psychological impact of this system was devastating and precisely calculated. Once people experienced life as their perfect selves, beautiful, healthy, strong, intelligent, free from pain and limitation, the prospect of returning to their original condition became unbearable. Tony had created the ultimate addiction, a dependence not on a chemical substance, but on an idealized version of oneself that felt more real and more true than the original. The daily subscription model meant that users had to pay Tony continuously for the privilege of remaining their enhanced selves. Those who couldn't afford the fees were forced to watch helplessly as their perfect bodies and minds slowly degraded back to their natural state. The wealthy could maintain their enhancement indefinitely, while the poor were condemned to exist as second-class citizens in a world where basic human dignity had become a luxury commodity. Tony marketed Extremis 3.0 with all the sophisticated manipulation techniques that modern technology companies use to create dependency on their products. He emphasized the convenience, the life-changing benefits, the sense of belonging to an exclusive community of enhanced individuals. He used social media algorithms and targeted advertising to make non-users feel inadequate and left behind. He created artificial scarcity and waiting lists to make the treatment seem more desirable. Most insidiously of all, He positioned himself not as a profiteer exploiting human insecurity, but as a visionary entrepreneur, bringing the benefits of advanced technology to the masses. He spoke eloquently about democratizing human enhancement, about giving everyone the opportunity to be their best self, about using innovation to solve the fundamental problems of the human condition. His public presentations were masterpieces of technological utopianism, painting a picture of a future where suffering and limitation were things of the past. The reality, of course, was far different from the marketing promises. Tony's vision of perfection was entirely his own, shaped by his particular aesthetic preferences and social prejudices. Extremist users didn't become idealized versions of themselves so much as they became idealized versions of what Tony Stark thought they should be. The technology subtly influenced their personalities, their desires, their goals, and their values, gradually molding them into the kind of people Tony preferred to have around him. The enhanced citizens of San Francisco became, in effect, Tony's extended ego made manifest in human form. They shared his tastes, his priorities, his worldview, and his conviction that they were superior to unenhanced humanity. They looked down on non-users with the same contempt that Tony felt for people he considered intellectually or technologically inferior. They became willing participants in their own subjugation, grateful to their benefactor for the privilege of being allowed to exist as improved versions of themselves. Tony's armor during this period reflected his psychological transformation as clearly as his actions did. The superior Iron Man suit was constructed from a revolutionary liquid metal smart material that could reshape itself at the molecular level in response to Tony's conscious and unconscious desires. The armor appeared as a brilliant silver-white surface that flowed and shifted like mercury, creating smooth, organic curves that seemed almost alien in their perfection. This wasn't just a technological advancement. It was a physical manifestation of Tony's belief that he had transcended normal human limitations and constraints. Where his traditional red and gold armor had been clearly mechanical, with visible joints and technological components, the superior suit appeared seamless and organic, like a second skin that was somehow more natural than his actual flesh. The liquid metal construction allowed the armor to self-repair damage instantly, adapt to new threats automatically, and function with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The aesthetic choice of silver-white coloring was equally symbolic. Gone were the warm, heroic colors that had defined Iron Man for decades. In their place was a cold, pristine surface that reflected the world around it, without revealing anything of the man within. The armor had become a mirror in the most literal sense, showing observers only their own reflection while concealing Tony's true nature behind an impenetrable facade of technological perfection. The suit's capabilities extended far beyond mere protection and flight. The liquid metal construction allowed it to function as a universal interface with any technological system, giving Tony unprecedented control over the increasingly connected world around him. He could hack into any computer network, manipulate any electronic device, and access any digital information simply by coming into physical contact with connected technology. In a world where everything from cars to kitchen appliances was networked and internet-enabled, this made Tony functionally omnipresent and omniscient within any urban environment. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the superior Iron Man armor was how perfectly it served as both tool and symbol of Tony's new philosophy. The suit didn't just protect him from physical harm, it insulated him completely from human contact and emotional connection. Inside his liquid metal cocoon, Tony was isolated from the messy, complicated, imperfect world of human relationships and moral obligations. He could interact with people entirely on his own terms, seeing them through sensors and cameras rather than with his own eyes, hearing them through audio pickups rather than with his own ears. This technological mediation of all human contact allowed Tony to treat other people as abstract problems to be solved rather than as individuals with their own rights, desires, and dignity. The armor literally dehumanized both Tony and everyone he encountered, reducing all social interaction to data streams and algorithmic analysis. He could optimize his responses for maximum psychological impact without ever having to confront the emotional reality of the suffering he was causing. The most chilling aspect of Superior Iron Man's reign was how believable and sustainable his system appeared to be. Unlike the grandiose schemes of traditional supervillains, Tony's approach to domination was sophisticated, incremental, and built on genuine technological achievement. He wasn't trying to conquer the world through force or intimidation. He was offering people something they genuinely wanted, and then gradually increasing the price until they couldn't afford to say no. His manipulation of market forces and consumer psychology was so subtle and effective that many of his victims never realized they were being victimized at all. They saw themselves as customers making rational economic decisions, paying for a service that genuinely improved their lives. The fact that they were also surrendering their autonomy, their dignity, and their fundamental humanity was presented as a minor side effect of progress, rather than the primary goal of the entire system. Tony's public persona during this period was perhaps the most disturbing element of his transformation. He didn't behave like a villain in any traditional sense. He was charming, articulate, and seemingly sincere in his belief that he was making the world a better place. He gave interviews to journalists, attended social functions, and maintained all the appearances of a responsible business leader and civic-minded philanthropist. His ability to present his exploitation of human vulnerability as technological philanthropy made him far more dangerous than any ranting megalomaniac could ever be. The psychological impact on other heroes was profound and lasting. Characters like Captain America and Spider-Man, who had trusted Tony with their lives and their secrets, were forced to confront the possibility that their friend and ally had always possessed the capacity for this level of moral corruption. The revelation that Tony's heroism had perhaps been maintained through willpower and social pressure rather than innate goodness raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism itself. When the inversion spell was eventually reversed and Tony returned to his normal moral alignment, the experience left lasting scars on both his psyche and his relationships with other heroes. The knowledge that he had been capable of such calculated cruelty, that he had found it so easy and natural to exploit human weakness for his own benefit, haunted him in ways that no external enemy ever could. He had seen his own potential for evil and found it terrifyingly familiar and comfortable. The Superior Iron Man era demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous villains are not those who reject heroic values entirely, but those who pervert those values in service of their own vision of what the world should be. Tony's belief that he was making people's lives better, that he was using his gifts to solve real problems and eliminate genuine suffering, made his actions more insidious than any simple quest for power or revenge could ever be. The storyline served as a powerful commentary on contemporary concerns about technology, capitalism, and the concentration of power in the hands of a wealthy, technological elite. Tony's transformation into Superior Iron Man reflected real-world anxieties about how brilliant, well-intentioned innovators could gradually become the very problems they had originally set out to solve. The character became a cautionary tale about the ease with which technological progress could become technological tyranny when moral considerations were subordinated to efficiency and profit. In the end, Superior Iron Man represents one of Marvel's most sophisticated explorations of how good people can become villains, not through external corruption or magical influence, but through the gradual erosion of moral boundaries in service of seemingly rational goals. Tony Stark's fall was so compelling precisely because it felt inevitable rather than contrived, the logical end result of character traits that had always been part of his personality. The Superior Iron Man wasn't a different person wearing Tony Stark's face. He was Tony Stark himself, finally free to be everything he had always had the potential to become. There is perhaps no more tragic figure in all of Marvel Comics than the Maestro. the future version of Bruce Banner who survived the end of the world only to become the very monster that civilization had always feared the Hulk might become. His story is one of ultimate survival purchased at the price of absolute moral corruption, a tale of how the strongest there is became the most tyrannical there is when all the forces that had once constrained his darker impulses were stripped away by nuclear fire and the passage of decades. The world that created the Maestro was born from humanity's oldest and most persistent nightmare, the fear that our capacity for destruction would eventually outstrip our wisdom to control it. In the timeline designated as Earth 921 by dimensional theorists, the Cold War never truly ended, but instead escalated through decades of increasing tension until it reached its inevitable, catastrophic conclusion. Nuclear weapons, biological agents, and exotic energy weapons were unleashed across the globe in a conflict so devastating that it made the horrors of previous wars seem like minor skirmishes by comparison. The Great War, as it came to be known by the scattered survivors, lasted only months in active combat, but its effects would poison the earth for centuries to come. Cities were reduced to radioactive craters, entire nations disappeared from the map, and the carefully constructed web of civilization collapsed under the weight of unimaginable destruction. The sky darkened with ash and radioactive particles, the oceans boiled with contamination, and the very air became a toxic mixture that could kill unprotected humans within hours of exposure. Most of Earth's heroes died in those final, desperate battles. Captain America fell defending an evacuation site in New York, his shield finally proving insufficient against the concentrated firepower of a dozen different factions fighting over the ruins of Manhattan. Iron Man's armor systems failed when electromagnetic pulses from nuclear detonations overwhelmed his technological defenses, leaving Tony Stark helpless in a suit that had become his metal coffin. Thor returned to Asgard as the Earth burned, unwilling or unable to intervene in a conflict that seemed to prove humanity's fundamental unworthiness of divine protection. Spider-Man died trying to save civilians trapped in the collapse of a military command bunker, his final words broadcast over emergency radio frequencies as he held up tons of concrete and steel long enough for others to escape. The X-Men perished in their school, using their powers to shield as many students as possible from the radiation that swept across Westchester County like an invisible tide of death. Doctor Strange disappeared into the mystic dimensions, either destroyed by forces beyond his ability to control or retreating from a reality that had become too broken to repair. But the Hulk survived. The same gamma radiation that had cursed Bruce Banner with his monstrous alter ego proved to be his salvation when the world itself became radioactive. While others succumbed to radiation poisoning within days or weeks of the initial attacks, the Hulk's unique physiology actually thrived in the contaminated environment. The ambient radiation that made the Earth uninhabitable for normal humans only served to make him stronger, more durable, and more capable of surviving in the hellscape that the planet had become. Bruce Banner's survival was both a blessing and a curse that he would carry for the rest of his unnaturally extended life. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as he wandered through the ruins of civilization looking for other survivors, he clung to the hope that his scientific knowledge and the Hulk's incredible strength could somehow help rebuild what had been lost. He worked tirelessly to establish safe zones for the scattered groups of humans who had managed to survive the initial devastation, using his dual nature to both protect them from the dangers of the new world and to solve the complex problems of survival in a radioactive wasteland. For years, perhaps even decades, Bruce Banner remained true to his heroic ideals despite the overwhelming bleakness of his circumstances. He used his scientific expertise to develop ways of purifying contaminated water, growing food in irradiated soil, and treating the various mutations and cancers that plagued the survivor communities. When raiders or mutant creatures threatened the settlements under his protection, The Hulk would emerge to defend the innocent with the same fierce determination that had once driven him to protect a world that had never fully accepted him. But the psychological toll of being perhaps the only traditional superhero left alive in a world that seemed determined to die slowly and painfully began to wear on Banner's sanity and moral foundations. He watched generations of survivors struggle against impossible odds, their children born twisted by radiation, their communities constantly threatened by dangers that seemed to multiply faster than they could be defeated. He saw good people make increasingly desperate choices in order to survive, watched as the thin veneer of civilization was gradually stripped away by the simple necessity of staying alive in a hostile environment. The isolation was perhaps the most corrosive force acting on Banner's psyche. For decades, he had been accustomed to the company and moral support of other heroes who shared his values and could help him maintain perspective on the larger meaning of their struggle. Now he was alone, the sole guardian of principles that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where survival trumped all other considerations. Without the moderating influence of peers who could challenge his decisions and offer alternative perspectives, Banner began to rely more and more heavily on his own judgment, his own assessment of what was necessary and justified. The transformation from protector to ruler happened so gradually that Banner himself might not have noticed the shift in his role and responsibilities. The survivor communities naturally looked to him for leadership, recognizing that his unique combination of scientific knowledge and superhuman power made him the most qualified person to make decisions about their collective welfare. His suggestions became requests, his requests became commands, and his commands became law, all in the name of protecting people who seemed incapable of protecting themselves. As the years passed and Banner's hair grew grey and then white, his patience with human weakness and short-sightedness began to wear thin. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own chance at a normal life, his own hope for peace in order to protect people who often seemed determined to repeat the same mistakes that had destroyed the world in the first place. Survivors would fight over resources instead of sharing them, would hoard supplies while their neighbors starved, would pursue petty feuds and personal vendettas, even when such conflicts weakened the entire community. The breaking point came when a group of survivors under Banner's protection decided to raid a neighboring settlement for food and medical supplies, despite his explicit orders to maintain peaceful relations with all other survivor groups. The raid resulted in casualties on both sides, destroyed months of careful diplomatic work, and ultimately led to a cycle of retribution that threatened to drag the entire region into a war that would have echoed the global conflict that had nearly ended human civilization. In that moment, as Banner surveyed the carnage caused by people he had spent years protecting and nurturing, something fundamental shifted in his worldview. These people, he realized, were not victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were active participants in their own destruction, driven by the same selfish impulses and tribal instincts that had led to the Great War in the first place. They were not worthy of protection. They were problems that needed to be solved, variables that needed to be controlled, obstacles that needed to be removed from the equation. The transformation from Bruce Banner into the Maestro was marked by his construction of a throne room in the ruins of a bombed-out government building, a space that would serve as both seat of power and monument to his own evolution from hero to ruler. The throne itself was built from the broken weapons and symbolic artifacts of the fallen heroes who had once been his allies and friends. Captain America's shattered shield formed the backrest, its stars and stripes now tarnished and cracked but still recognizable as symbols of ideals that had died with their bearer. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, lay broken at the base of the throne, its enchantments finally exhausted by the magical energies unleashed during the final war. Iron Man's helmet, its glowing eye slits now dark and empty, served as one armrest, while various other artifacts from deceased heroes were incorporated into the throne's construction. The message was clear to anyone who entered the throne room. The age of heroes was over, and the age of the maestro had begun. The maestro's approach to ruling was informed by his decades of experience trying to protect ungrateful and self-destructive humans through kindness and moral example. He had learned that people could not be trusted to make the right decisions even when their own survival depended on it, that they required firm guidance and strict discipline in order to avoid destroying themselves and others. His rule was absolute and uncompromising, backed by the kind of physical power that made resistance not just futile but literally impossible. Under the maestro's dominion, the surviving human settlements were reorganized according to principles of maximum efficiency and minimum conflict. Resources were distributed according to need as determined by the maestro himself, eliminating the waste and competition that had characterized earlier attempts at democratic governance. Work assignments were made based on individual abilities and the collective good rather than personal preference or ambition. Reproduction was carefully regulated to prevent overpopulation and ensure that children were born only to parents who could provide proper care and education. Those who violated the maestro's laws or challenged his authority were given opportunities to prove their worth in gladiatorial combat, fighting against wild animals, mutant creatures, or each other for the entertainment of their fellow citizens and the edification of their ruler. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They provided an outlet for the violent impulses that seemed to be hardwired into human nature. They demonstrated the consequences of disobedience to potential troublemakers, and they satisfied the maestro's own need for entertainment in a world that offered few genuine pleasures or diversions. The gladiatorial arena became the centerpiece of the maestro's society, a place where the fundamental questions of life and death were decided through pure physical contest rather than the complex moral and ethical considerations that had paralyzed the old world. The strongest survived, the weak perished, and everyone understood exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy. It was a system that the maestro found refreshingly honest and efficient compared to the hypocritical democratic ideals that had ultimately proven incapable of preventing global catastrophe. The maestro's own physical transformation reflected the decades of exposure to ambient radiation and the gradual corruption of his moral character. Where the Hulk had once been green, the maestro's skin had taken on a more mottled, greyish hue that spoke to the toxic environment he had adapted to survive. His body had grown even more massive and powerful than the traditional Hulk form, enhanced by decades of constant low-level radiation exposure that had pushed his gamma-powered physiology to new extremes of strength and durability. But perhaps the most significant change was in his facial features and expression. Where the Hulk's face had typically shown raw emotion, anger, confusion, pain, or innocent joy, the maestro's features displayed the cold calculation and weary cynicism of a ruler who had seen too much of human nature to retain any illusions about the species he governed. His eyes held the depth of decades of experience and the hardness of someone who had made countless difficult decisions without the luxury of moral uncertainty. The maestro's intelligence represented the full integration of Bruce Banner's scientific genius with the Hulk's raw power, creating a being who could outthink his opponents as easily as he could overpower them. He understood human psychology with the clarity that came from decades of observation and manipulation, could predict the behavior of individuals and groups with uncanny accuracy, and could devise strategies and contingency plans that accounted for every possible variable in any given situation. This combination of overwhelming physical power with strategic brilliance made the maestro perhaps the most dangerous version of the Hulk that had ever existed. Traditional opponents who might have been able to exploit the Hulk's simple-minded rage or Banner's physical vulnerability found themselves facing an enemy who possessed all of their strengths and none of their weaknesses. The maestro could not be reasoned with because he had already considered and rejected every possible argument for changing his methods. He could not be defeated through superior strategy because his own tactical thinking was informed by decades of experience and enhanced by gamma-powered mental abilities. The most tragic aspect of the Maestro's story was revealed when time travel technology allowed the present-day Hulk to be brought forward to this future timeline, creating a confrontation between what Bruce Banner was and what he was destined to become. The meeting between the two versions of the same character was both a battle for the fate of the world and a philosophical debate about the nature of heroism, power, and moral responsibility. The Maestro's attempts to convert his younger self were chillingly logical and persuasive. He pointed out that the present-day Hulk's heroic ideals had ultimately led to nothing but frustration and failure, that his attempts to protect humanity had been met with fear, ingratitude, and betrayal. He demonstrated how the traditional approach of trying to save everyone had resulted in saving no one, while his own methods had at least preserved some remnant of human civilization in a world that would otherwise have been completely uninhabitable. The younger Hulk's horror at what he was destined to become was met with the Maestro's patient explanation that this transformation was not corruption but evolution, not a fall from grace, but a rise to a higher level of understanding about the true nature of power and responsibility. The Maestro had learned to accept the burden of making the hard choices that other heroes were too weak or too sentimental to make, had embraced his role as humanity's shepherd, even when that role required him to cull the flock for the good of the whole. The philosophical core of their conflict centered on the question of whether it was better to preserve heroic ideals in a world where they accomplished nothing, or to abandon those ideals in favor of methods that actually produced results. The Maestro argued that true heroism lay not in maintaining moral purity, but in accepting the responsibility of absolute power and using it to create the best possible outcomes for the greatest number of people. The present-day Hulk insisted that the means were as important as the ends, that a victory achieved through tyranny and oppression was no victory at all. The battle between past and future, between hero and tyrant, between idealism and pragmatism, represented one of the most psychologically complex confrontations in comic book history. It was not simply a fight between good and evil, but a struggle between different definitions of what constituted good, between competing visions of how power should be used and what responsibilities came with strength. The resolution of their conflict, while temporarily preventing the Maestro's timeline from coming to pass, could not erase the fundamental questions that his existence had raised about the nature of heroism and the sustainability of moral idealism in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Maestro had not become a monster through external corruption or magical influence, but through the logical progression of his own experiences and the gradual erosion of his faith in humanity's capacity for self-improvement. In the end, the Maestro represents the dark answer to one of superhero fiction's most persistent questions: what happens when the hero finally wins completely? When all opposition is crushed and all resistance is eliminated? The Maestro had achieved the ultimate victory that every hero dreams of, had created a world where evil could not flourish and good would always triumph. But that world was also one where freedom had been sacrificed for security, where diversity had been eliminated in favor of efficiency, and where the very qualities that made life worth living had been subordinated to the simple goal of survival. The Maestro stands as a warning that the greatest threats to heroic values may not come from external enemies, but from the heroes themselves. That the same strength and determination that makes someone capable of protecting others can also make them capable of controlling others when protection transforms into domination. His story suggests that the most dangerous moment in any hero's career may not be when they face their greatest enemy, but when they finally achieve their greatest victory and must decide what to do with the absolute power that victory has granted them. In the infinite tapestry of cosmic forces that governs the Marvel Universe, few entities embody both creation and destruction as completely as the Phoenix Force, that primordial cosmic fire that burns at the heart of all existence. It is the spark that ignites new stars and the flame that consumes dying worlds, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth made manifest as a being of such incredible power that it exists beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. And when that cosmic force chose to bond with Jean Grey, one of the most compassionate and psychically gifted members of the X-Men, it created a union that would become both one of Marvel's greatest triumphs and its most heartbreaking tragedy. Jean Grey had always been different, even among the extraordinary individuals who comprised Professor Xavier's school for gifted youngsters. Her telepathic abilities had manifested at a traumatically young age when she witnessed the death of her childhood friend Annie Richardson in a car accident, experiencing not just the visual horror of the event but actually feeling Annie's consciousness fade away through their psychic connection. The trauma of that experience had left deep scars on Jean's psyche, wounds that would never fully heal and that would make her particularly vulnerable to the overwhelming sensations and emotions that came with cosmic-level telepathic powers. Professor Charles Xavier had worked carefully with young Jean to help her develop mental barriers and protective mechanisms that would allow her to function in a world filled with billions of thinking minds, each one broadcasting thoughts and emotions that her telepathy could potentially pick up and absorb. These psychic shields were necessary for her survival and sanity, but they also served to limit her access to her true potential, keeping her powers at a manageable level that wouldn't overwhelm her still developing consciousness. As Jean matured and joined the X-Men, she became known as Marvel Girl, using her telekinetic and telepathic abilities to fight alongside Cyclops, Beast, Angel, and Iceman in their mission to protect a world that feared and hated them. Her powers were impressive by any standard, allowing her to move objects with her mind, read thoughts, project mental images, and create telepathic links between herself and others. But even at their peak, her abilities were clearly human in scope and limitation, remarkable but ultimately comprehensible within the framework of mutant genetics and psychic phenomena. The transformation that would change everything began during a mission to save a space shuttle that had been caught in a deadly solar radiation storm. The X-Men had rushed to the rescue in their own spacecraft, but the radiation levels were so intense that their ship's protective systems were failing rapidly. Someone would have to pilot the shuttle to safety through the deadly storm, a task that would almost certainly prove fatal to anyone who attempted it due to the massive amounts of cosmic radiation involved. Jean Grey volunteered for what everyone understood to be a suicide mission, using her telekinetic powers to wrap herself in a protective cocoon of psychic energy while she piloted the shuttle through the radiation storm and back to Earth's safety. Her teammates watched helplessly as she was bombarded by levels of cosmic energy that should have killed her instantly, her life signs fading as the shuttle's instruments registered radiation doses that were beyond the upper limits of human survival. The crash landing in Jamaica Bay should have marked the end of Jean Grey's story, another heroic sacrifice in the long tradition of X-Men who had given their lives to protect innocent people. Her teammates pulled her unconscious form from the wreckage expecting to find her dying or already dead from radiation poisoning, but instead she seemed to be somehow changed, transformed by her exposure to the cosmic forces that had surrounded her during her journey through the solar storm. What none of them realized at the time was that Jean Grey had indeed died in that radiation storm, her consciousness extinguished by forces beyond human ability to withstand. But in the moment of her death, she had been noticed by the Phoenix Force, that cosmic entity which exists to preserve life and ensure the continuation of existence throughout the universe. The Phoenix had been drawn to Jean's sacrifice, to her willingness to give up her own life to preserve the lives of others, and it had chosen to bond with her dying consciousness, creating something entirely new from the union of human compassion and cosmic power. The being that emerged from Jamaica Bay appeared to be Jean Grey in every way that mattered to her friends and loved ones. She had Jean's memories, her personality, her relationships, and her deep emotional connections to the X-Men and to Scott Summers, the man she loved. But she also possessed power on a scale that dwarfed anything she had demonstrated before, abilities that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day as she learned to access more and more of the Phoenix Force's cosmic potential. Initially, these enhanced abilities seemed like an unqualified blessing. The Phoenix-enhanced Jean could accomplish feats that had previously been impossible, healing injuries that should have been fatal, manipulating matter at the molecular level, and accessing psychic abilities that allowed her to communicate across vast distances and even across dimensional barriers. She became one of the most powerful beings on Earth, capable of standing toe-to-toe with cosmic-level threats that would have overwhelmed the entire X-Men team working together. For a time, this new Jean used her incredible abilities exactly as her friends and teammates would have expected to protect innocent people, to advance the cause of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, and to help the X-Men in their never-ending battle against the forces of prejudice and hatred. The Phoenix Force seemed to amplify all of Jean's best qualities: her compassion, her dedication to helping others, her willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, while providing her with the power necessary to make a real difference in the world. But cosmic power on such a vast scale inevitably came with a price that none of them had anticipated. The Phoenix Force was not simply a source of energy that Jean could tap into when needed. It was a living entity with its own desires, its own agenda, and its own understanding of what was best for the universe. As Jean's connection to the Phoenix deepened, she began to experience sensations and emotions that were fundamentally alien to human consciousness. Cosmic perspectives that dwarfed human concerns and made individual lives seem insignificant in the face of universal cycles of creation and destruction. The gradual transformation from Phoenix to Dark Phoenix was so subtle that even Jean herself didn't recognize what was happening until it was too late to reverse the process. The cosmic entity's influence on her thoughts and emotions was insidious, working below the level of conscious awareness to slowly alter her priorities and reshape her understanding of morality and responsibility. Where once she had valued individual human lives as sacred and irreplaceable, she began to see them as small components in a much larger cosmic design, important only insofar as they served the Phoenix Force's ultimate goals. The first signs of trouble appeared during battles with cosmic-level threats, when Jean's responses to danger became increasingly disproportionate to the actual level of threat involved. Enemies who might have been defeated through careful strategy and teamwork were instead obliterated with casual displays of power that left her teammates uncomfortable and concerned. She began to show irritation with the limitations and weaknesses of her human companions, becoming impatient with their inability to keep up with her enhanced capabilities and cosmic perspective. The changes in Jean's personality were most noticeable to Scott Summers, whose intimate relationship with her allowed him to observe subtle shifts in her behavior and emotional responses that others might have missed. The woman he loved was still recognizably Jean Grey, but there was something different about her, something that seemed to burn just behind her eyes like a flame that was growing stronger and more difficult to control with each passing day. The transformation reached a critical point during an encounter with the Hellfire Club, a secret organization of wealthy and powerful individuals who sought to manipulate global events for their own benefit. The club's inner circle, led by Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost, had developed a plan to corrupt Jean Grey and bend her incredible powers to their will. Using a combination of psychic manipulation and carefully crafted illusions to break down her mental defenses and expose her to the full influence of the Phoenix Force. Their scheme involved creating a detailed psychic fantasy that convinced Jean she was living the life of one of her ancestors, a woman who had experienced passion, betrayal, and tragedy in 18th century London. The illusion was designed to overwhelm Jean's carefully maintained psychological barriers and allow the darker aspects of the Phoenix Force to emerge, transforming her from protector into destroyer through the simple expedient of removing her human moral constraints. The plan worked far better than its creators had anticipated, but not in the way they had hoped to control. The psychic manipulation did indeed shatter Jean's mental defenses and allow the Phoenix Force's full power to manifest through her consciousness. But the resulting entity was far beyond anyone's ability to control or direct. The Dark Phoenix that emerged from the Hellfire Club's machinations was a being of such terrible power and cosmic hunger that she instantly became a threat not just to Earth but to the entire universe. The physical transformation was as dramatic as the psychological one. Where the Phoenix had enhanced Jean's natural beauty and given her an aura of warmth and life-giving energy, the Dark Phoenix burned with a cold fire that seemed to consume light rather than generate it. Her costume shifted from the vibrant gold and red of the Phoenix to a dark crimson that seemed to absorb the colors around it, and her eyes blazed with an inner flame that held no trace of human warmth or compassion. The Dark Phoenix's first act was to demonstrate the vast gulf that now separated her from her former human concerns and limitations. With casual ease, she neutralized the Hellfire Club members who had been responsible for her transformation, not out of anger or desire for revenge, but simply because their continued existence was inconvenient to her cosmic agenda. She treated their desperate attempts to reason with her or bargain for their lives with the same detached interest that a human might show toward the struggles of insects. Her former teammates in the X-Men found themselves facing an impossible situation. The woman they loved and had fought alongside for years was still recognizably Jean Grey, but she was also something else entirely. A cosmic entity wearing Jean's face and speaking with Jean's voice while pursuing goals that were completely alien to human understanding. Their attempts to reach her through appeals to their shared history and emotional bonds were met with polite but distant acknowledgement, as if she was humoring children who couldn't understand the sophisticated games that adults played. The tragedy of the Dark Phoenix was not simply that she had become evil in any conventional sense, but that she had moved beyond human concepts of good and evil entirely. She wasn't motivated by hatred, greed, or desire for power. She was driven by cosmic hunger and the Phoenix Force's fundamental nature as an entity of creation and destruction. From her perspective, the lives she destroyed were simply fuel for the cosmic fires that would eventually give birth to new forms of life and consciousness throughout the universe. The true horror of what Jean had become was revealed when the Dark Phoenix left Earth to explore the cosmos and satisfy her growing hunger for new experiences and sensations. Her journey took her to the Debari system, where she encountered a star that was perfectly suited to her cosmic appetite. Without hesitation or remorse, she began to consume the star's nuclear fires, feeding on the fusion reactions that had sustained it for billions of years and would have continued to do so for billions more. The consumption of the Debari star was accomplished with the casual ease of someone eating a piece of fruit, but the consequences were beyond human comprehension in their scope and finality. As the star died, its planetary system was destroyed, including Debari itself, a world inhabited by billions of intelligent beings who had developed their own civilization, culture, and understanding of the universe. In a matter of minutes, an entire species was extinguished, countless individual lives snuffed out to satisfy the Dark Phoenix's cosmic hunger. The genocide of the Debari was not an act of malice or cruelty from the Dark Phoenix's perspective, but simply the inevitable consequence of her nature and needs. She experienced no more guilt or remorse about destroying an inhabited world than a human would feel about consuming food to sustain their own life. The destruction was necessary for her continued existence and growth, and the moral implications that would have horrified Jean Grey were simply irrelevant to the cosmic entity she had become. When news of the Debari system's destruction reached Earth, the X-Men were forced to confront the full magnitude of what their teammate had become. The woman they had known as Jean Grey, who had once risked her life to save a shuttle full of strangers, was now responsible for the deaths of billions of innocent beings. The cosmic entity wearing her face and speaking with her voice had become one of the most dangerous threats the universe had ever faced, capable of destroying entire civilizations to satisfy her endless hunger for power and experience. The X-Men's attempts to reach whatever remained of Jean's human consciousness were complicated by the fact that she genuinely didn't seem to understand why they were upset by her actions. From her cosmic perspective, the destruction of the Debari was no more significant than the death of bacteria in a petri dish, a minor event in the grand scheme of universal existence. She was puzzled and somewhat amused by their emotional reactions, treating their grief and horror as evidence of their limited understanding rather than as valid moral concerns. The confrontation between the X-Men and the Dark Phoenix was perhaps the most emotionally devastating battle in the team's history, because they were not simply fighting a powerful enemy, but trying to save someone they loved from herself. Every attack they launched against her was also an attack against Jean Grey. Every strategy they employed to stop her was also a potential method of destroying the woman who had been the heart and soul of their team for years. Scott Summers faced the most impossible position of all, torn between his duty to stop a cosmic threat and his love for the woman who had become that threat. His optic blasts, which had once been used to protect Jean from danger, were now turned against her in desperate attempts to break through the Phoenix Force's influence and restore her human consciousness. The irony was crushing. The man who loved Jean Grey more than anyone else in the world was being forced to fight against her with everything he had, knowing that victory might mean losing her forever. The other X-Men struggled with their own conflicts between duty and love, between their responsibility to protect innocent life throughout the universe and their desire to save their friend and teammate. Professor Xavier's attempts to reach Jean through telepathic contact were rebuffed by cosmic-level mental defenses that dwarfed anything he had ever encountered. Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, and Nightcrawler found their combined physical abilities utterly inadequate against an opponent who could manipulate matter and energy on a planetary scale. The resolution of the Dark Phoenix saga came not through external intervention or superior force, but through a brief moment of clarity in which Jean Grey's human consciousness managed to reassert itself long enough to recognize what she had become and what she was capable of doing. The realization that she was responsible for the genocide of an entire species, that her cosmic hunger would inevitably lead to more such atrocities, filled her with horror and self-loathing that pierced through the Phoenix Force's cosmic detachment like a blade through armor. In that moment of terrible clarity, Jean Grey made the ultimate heroic choice. She chose to end her own life, rather than allow the Dark Phoenix to continue its cosmic rampage. Using a piece of alien technology that she had encountered during her travels, she arranged for her own destruction in a way that would also eliminate the Phoenix Force's connection to her consciousness, preventing the cosmic entity from simply resurrecting her and continuing its destructive path. Jean's final sacrifice was witnessed by Scott Summers and the other X-Men, who watched helplessly as the woman they loved chose death over the possibility of causing more harm to innocent beings throughout the universe. Her last words were an apology, not for the power she had wielded or the cosmic forces she had encountered, but for the pain her transformation had caused to those who cared about her most. The death of Jean Grey and the Dark Phoenix marked the end of one of Marvel's most ambitious and emotionally complex storylines, but it also established themes and concepts that would resonate throughout the company's comics for decades to come. The story demonstrated that even the most heroic individuals could be corrupted by power beyond their ability to control, that good intentions were no guarantee against the seductive influence of absolute power, and that sometimes the most heroic choice was knowing when to stop rather than continuing to fight. The Dark Phoenix saga also explored the terrifying possibility that there might be forces in the universe so vast and alien that human morality and ethics were simply inadequate to contain them. The Phoenix Force was not evil in any conventional sense. It was simply operating according to its own cosmic nature and purposes, which happened to be incompatible with human concepts of individual worth and moral responsibility. Jean's tragedy was not that she had chosen to become evil, but that she had been exposed to perspectives and powers that made human choice increasingly irrelevant to her actions. The lasting impact of the Dark Phoenix story lies in its unflinching examination of the price of ultimate power and the fragility of human moral constraints when faced with cosmic-level responsibilities. Jean Grey's fall from hero to cosmic threat serves as a warning that the same qualities that make someone capable of great good, compassion, intelligence, willingness to sacrifice for others, can also make them vulnerable to corruption when those qualities are amplified beyond human scale and understanding. The character of Dark Phoenix has become one of Marvel's most enduring symbols of tragic heroism, representing the thin line between salvation and damnation that all heroes must navigate. Her story reminds us that the greatest threats to heroic values may not come from external enemies but from the heroes themselves, when their desire to do good is overwhelmed by power that exceeds their wisdom to control it. In the end, Jean Grey's ultimate heroism lay not in the cosmic power she wielded as Phoenix, but in her human choice to reject that power when she realized the price it demanded from the universe and from her own soul. There is perhaps no more tragic figure in the pantheon of fallen heroes than Logan, the man known to the world as Wolverine, whose transformation into the tyrannical weapon Omega represents the complete abandonment of every principle that had once defined his heroic nature. In the harsh reality of the Age of Apocalypse timeline, designated as Earth 295 by dimensional catalogers, the world had been shaped by forces so brutal and unforgiving that even the strongest moral foundations could be gradually eroded until nothing remained but the cold logic of survival and domination. The Logan of Earth 295 had begun his journey much as his mainstream counterpart had. As a man haunted by a past he couldn't fully remember, and driven by instincts that pulled him toward violence, even as his conscious mind sought something better. He had been subjected to the same horrific experiments that had bonded adamantium to his skeleton, had endured the same memory wipes and psychological conditioning designed to turn him into the perfect living weapon. But where the mainstream Wolverine had found his path to redemption through his relationships with the X-Men and his gradual acceptance of his role as protector and mentor, this Logan had found something else entirely. The Age of Apocalypse timeline had been created through a single moment of temporal interference that changed the course of mutant history forever. When David Haller, Professor Xavier's psychologically unstable son, traveled back in time to kill Magneto before he could become a threat to his father's dream of peaceful coexistence, his mission went catastrophically wrong. Instead of eliminating Magneto, David accidentally killed Charles Xavier himself, removing the most powerful force for peaceful human-mutant relations from the timeline and creating a power vacuum that was quickly filled by far more sinister influences. Without Professor Xavier's school to provide sanctuary for young mutants, or his philosophy of peaceful coexistence to guide mutant-human relations, the world devolved into a nightmare of genetic warfare and survival of the fittest. Apocalypse, the ancient mutant who believed that only the strong deserved to survive, rose to power and established a global empire built on the principle that might makes right. Under his rule, mutants with useful powers were elevated to positions of authority over humans, who were relegated to the status of slaves, test subjects, or entertainment for their genetic superiors. In this harsh new reality, Logan found himself fighting alongside a very different version of the X-Men, led not by the gentle Professor Xavier, but by Magneto, who had been transformed by Xavier's death from a militant separatist into a reluctant champion of Xavier's dream. The X-Men of this timeline were harder, more pragmatic, and more willing to use lethal force than their mainstream counterparts. Shaped by a world where mercy was often interpreted as weakness and hesitation could mean death for countless innocents. Logan's relationship with Jean Grey in this timeline became the defining emotional connection of his existence, far more central to his identity and purpose than it had ever been in the mainstream reality. Where his mainstream counterpart had harbored unrequited feelings for Jean while respecting her relationship with Scott Summers, the Age of Apocalypse Logan found himself in a world where Jean returned his affections and became his partner in both love and war. She became his anchor to humanity, the person who reminded him that there was still something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Jean Grey's love gave Logan something he had never truly possessed in any timeline, a sense of peace and belonging that went beyond his role as a warrior or his reputation as the best there is at what he does. With her, he could imagine a future that wasn't defined by violence and conflict, a world where his healing factor and combat skills might become relics of a more barbaric time rather than daily necessities for survival. She helped him access parts of his personality that had been buried beneath layers of conditioning and trauma, showing him that he was capable of tenderness, vulnerability, and genuine happiness. For years, Logan and Jean fought side by side against Apocalypse's forces, part of a desperate resistance movement that sought to preserve some vestige of Xavier's dream in a world that seemed determined to crush all hope beneath the weight of genetic superiority and brutal pragmatism. Their love story played out against a backdrop of constant warfare, stolen moments of intimacy between battles, shared dreams of a better future, whispered in the darkness between missions that might well be their last. The turning point came during the final assault on Apocalypse's citadel, a desperate gambit by the combined forces of the X-Men, the Human Resistance, and various other factions that had grown tired of living under the ancient mutants' tyrannical rule. The battle was brutal and costly, with heroes and villains alike falling before the overwhelming power of Apocalypse and his horsemen. Logan fought with the desperate fury of a man who knew that everything he cared about hung in the balance, his adamantium claws carving through enemy forces as he struggled to reach Jean's side in the chaos of the final confrontation. But victory, when it finally came, was purchased at a price that Logan could never have anticipated or accepted. Jean Grey died in the battle, not heroically or meaningfully, but randomly and pointlessly, cut down by stray energy blasts in the confusion of the melee. Logan reached her side just in time to hold her as her life faded away, to hear her final words of love and hope for the future they would never share together. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside Logan's psyche, a connection to hope and humanity that could never be fully repaired. The immediate aftermath of Apocalypse's defeat should have been a time of celebration and rebuilding, an opportunity for the survivors to create the better world that so many had died to make possible. But Logan found himself unable to participate in the reconstruction efforts, unable to share in the optimism and hope that energized the other survivors. Without Jean, the future seemed empty and meaningless, a hollow victory that had cost him the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. In his grief and rage, Logan began to see the world through different eyes, no longer filtered through Jean's compassionate perspective, but viewed through the lens of his own pain and loss. The humans who had been liberated from Apocalypse's rule seemed ungrateful and quick to return to their old prejudices against mutants. The mutants who had fought alongside him in the resistance began to fracture into competing factions, each convinced that their vision for the future was the only valid one. The world that Jean had died to save appeared to be reverting to the same patterns of conflict and hatred that had enabled Apocalypse's rise to power in the first place. The gradual transformation from grief-stricken hero to authoritarian ruler was so subtle that Logan himself might not have recognized it happening. His initial involvement in post-war governance was motivated by a genuine desire to honor Jean's memory by helping to create the peaceful world she had envisioned. He used his combat experience and strategic knowledge to help maintain order during the chaotic transition period, his reputation as one of the Resistance's greatest heroes giving weight to his opinions and recommendations. But as Logan became more involved in the day-to-day decisions of governance, he began to notice how often other people's choices seemed to lead toward conflict and suffering rather than peace and prosperity. Humans would form anti-mutant organizations despite owing their freedom to mutant heroes. Mutants would use their powers to exploit or intimidate normal humans despite having fought to free them from Apocalypse's oppression. Politicians would make promises they had no intention of keeping. Religious leaders would preach hatred disguised as righteousness. And ordinary citizens would choose comfort and security over justice and equality every time those values came into conflict. Logan's growing disillusionment with democratic decision-making was reinforced by his own traumatic experiences with the consequences of other people's choices. Jean had died because someone in the Resistance command structure had made a tactical error. Apocalypse had risen to power because Charles Xavier had tried to show mercy to his enemies. The world had devolved into genetic warfare because humans and mutants had been unable to find common ground through peaceful negotiation. The philosophical shift from protector to controller happened gradually, justified at each step by Logan's genuine desire to prevent the kind of senseless suffering that had taken Jean away from him. If people couldn't be trusted to make the right decisions, then perhaps someone with superior experience and judgment needed to make those decisions for them. If democracy led to chaos and conflict, then perhaps a more direct form of governance was required to maintain the peace that so many had died to achieve. Logan's transformation into Weapon Omega was marked by his decision to enhance his already formidable capabilities through technological augmentation, accepting cybernetic implants and biological modifications that pushed his mutant abilities beyond their natural limits. The healing factor that had always been his greatest asset was enhanced through nanotechnology that could repair damage at the cellular level in seconds rather than minutes. His senses were augmented through neural implants that gave him awareness of electronic communications, thermal signatures, and biochemical changes across vast distances. Most significantly, his skeleton was reinforced with additional adamantium plating, and his claws were replaced with weapons that could extend to several times their original length and reconfigure themselves for different tactical situations. The enhancements made him faster, stronger, and more durable than he had ever been, but they also served to distance him further from his humanity, replacing organic tissue with artificial components that felt no pain and required no rest. The visual transformation was as dramatic as the psychological one. Where Wolverine had typically worn simple, practical clothing that allowed for maximum mobility, Weapon Omega dressed himself in elaborate armor that combined advanced technology with symbolic elements designed to project authority and inspire fear. His helmet concealed his facial features behind a mask that displayed only glowing optical sensors, creating a barrier between himself and the people he governed that was both literal and metaphorical. The costume served multiple purposes beyond mere protection. It announced to the world that Logan had moved beyond such petty human concerns as individual identity and emotional connection. He was no longer a person with hopes, fears, and personal relationships, but an instrument of order and justice who would make the difficult decisions that others were too weak or too sentimental to make. The armor made him appear larger, more imposing, and less human, which was exactly the image he wanted to project to potential troublemakers and dissidents. Weapon Omega's approach to ruling was informed by his decades of experience in warfare and his intimate understanding of how violence could be used as a tool of policy. He didn't rely on the complex legal systems and bureaucratic structures that had characterized pre-war governments, but instead implemented a direct, personal form of leadership that cut through red tape and eliminated the delays and compromises that had made previous administrations ineffective. His laws were simple, clearly stated, and backed by the absolute certainty that violations would be met with swift and decisive punishment. Citizens who contributed to society through productive work were rewarded with security, comfort, and the protection of the state. Those who chose to engage in criminal activity, political dissent, or other forms of social disruption were dealt with according to their level of threat. Minor offenders were subjected to rehabilitation programs designed to correct their antisocial tendencies, while serious criminals were simply eliminated as obstacles to the greater good. The mutant population under Weapon Omega's rule found themselves in a position of privilege and responsibility that reflected their superior abilities and their role in the resistance against apocalypse. Mutants with useful powers were given positions of authority within the government and military, while those with less practical abilities were encouraged to use their gifts in service of the state through scientific research, artistic endeavors, or other forms of cultural contribution. Humans, while not actively oppressed in the manner they had been under Apocalypse's rule, were clearly understood to be the junior partners in this new social order. They were protected and provided for, but their role was primarily to serve as the workforce and support structure for a civilization designed and directed by their genetic superiors. This arrangement was presented not as oppression, but as the natural order of things, a recognition of biological realities that previous governments had been too politically correct to acknowledge. The most disturbing aspect of Weapon Omega's reign was how reasonable and logical his policies appeared to be when viewed from his perspective. Unlike traditional tyrants who ruled through fear and brutality for their own gratification, Logan genuinely believed that his authoritarian methods were necessary for the greater good of all citizens, both human and mutant. He had seen the consequences of allowing people to make their own choices, had witnessed firsthand how democratic decision-making could lead to conflict, suffering, and the deaths of good people like Jean Grey. His system of governance eliminated the inefficiencies and contradictions that had plagued previous attempts at post-war reconstruction. Resources were distributed according to need and merit rather than political connections or economic advantage. Crime rates dropped to nearly zero under his direct oversight. Scientific research proceeded without being hampered by ethical committees or political considerations. Art and culture flourished under state patronage that rewarded talent and innovation rather than commercial appeal or popular taste. From the perspective of most citizens living under Weapon Omega's rule, life was safer, more prosperous, and more predictable than it had been in generations. The constant fear of random violence that had characterized the Age of Apocalypse was replaced by the security that came with knowing that strong leadership would protect them from both external threats and internal conflicts. Even those who disagreed with specific policies had to admit that the system produced results that democratic governments had never been able to achieve. But the price of this efficiency and security was the gradual erosion of individual agency and personal freedom that Logan's subjects might not have fully recognized until it was too late to resist. Weapon Omega's state provided for all their material needs while slowly eliminating their capacity to make meaningful choices about their own lives. Citizens were assigned careers based on their abilities and the needs of society rather than their personal preferences. Reproductive decisions were influenced by genetic counseling programs designed to improve the overall health and capabilities of future generations. Even recreational activities were guided by state recommendations about what forms of entertainment were most beneficial for social cohesion and individual development. The transformation of Logan into Weapon Omega represented the complete abandonment of the moral code that had once defined his heroic identity. Where Wolverine had always struggled to balance his violent instincts with his desire to protect innocent people, Weapon Omega felt no such internal conflict because he had redefined innocence in terms of compliance with his vision of social order. Where Wolverine had respected individual autonomy and the right of people to make their own mistakes, Weapon Omega saw such freedoms as luxuries that society could no longer afford given the catastrophic consequences of poor decision-making. The most tragic aspect of Logan's fall was that he remained convinced throughout his transformation that he was honoring Jean Grey's memory and working toward the better world she had died to create. In his mind, every authoritarian decree was justified by the need to prevent the kind of chaos and conflict that had led to her death. Every restriction on personal freedom was balanced against the security and prosperity that his leadership provided to the people under his protection. Weapon Omega's subjects lived in a world where want and fear had been eliminated, where every citizen had a role to play and a contribution to make, where the strong protected the weak and the intelligent guided the simple. It was, by many objective measures, a better world than the one that had existed before his rise to power. But it was also a world where the human spirit had been carefully managed and controlled, where individual dreams and desires had been subordinated to collective needs and social stability. The Logan who had become Weapon Omega would have been horrified by what his mainstream counterpart represented, a man who continued to believe in individual freedom and personal choice, despite having seen the terrible consequences that such beliefs could produce. From Weapon Omega's perspective, mainstream Wolverine was a fool who had learned nothing from his own experiences with loss and betrayal, who continued to trust in the goodness of people who had repeatedly proven themselves unworthy of such trust. The contrast between the two versions of Logan highlighted the fundamental question at the heart of all discussions about heroism and leadership: whether it is better to preserve idealistic principles in a world where they accomplish nothing, or to abandon those principles in favor of methods that actually produce positive results for the greatest number of people. Weapon Omega had chosen effectiveness over purity, results over principles, and order over freedom, becoming everything that his heroic counterpart had sworn never to become. In the end, Weapon Omega represented the dark mirror of heroic sacrifice, showing how the same willingness to give up personal happiness for the greater good could lead to very different conclusions about what the greater good actually required. Logan's transformation from protector to ruler, from hero to tyrant, served as a warning about the dangers of allowing grief and disillusionment to poison the moral foundations that separate heroism from tyranny, protection from control, and service from domination. The man who had once embodied the possibility of redemption through love and sacrifice had become living proof that even the strongest moral compass could be broken by the right combination of loss, responsibility, and the gradual erosion of faith in humanity's capacity for self-improvement. Weapon Omega stood as a testament to the fragility of heroic ideals when they are tested by the harsh realities of leadership and the terrible burden of making decisions that affect millions of lives. In the pantheon of American cultural symbols, few figures carry the weight of moral authority and inspirational leadership that has been embodied by Steve Rogers, the man who became Captain America. For more than 8 decades, both in the real world and within the Marvel Universe, the shield-bearing super soldier has represented the highest ideals of heroism, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to the principles of freedom and justice. He has been the moral compass by which other heroes measure themselves, the steady voice of reason in times of crisis, and the living embodiment of the belief that doing the right thing is always worth the personal cost. But in the darkest chapter of Marvel Comics history, this beacon of hope and righteousness was transformed into something so fundamentally antithetical to everything he had once represented that the very foundations of the superhero community were shaken to their core. The emergence of Captain Hydra, the version of Steve Rogers who revealed himself to be a lifelong agent of the fascist organization he had spent decades fighting, represented not just the fall of a single hero, but the corruption of the very symbol of heroic virtue itself. The transformation of Captain America into Captain Hydra began with a cosmic entity known as Kobik, a sentient cosmic cube who had taken the form of a young girl and possessed the reality-altering powers that came with her connection to the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. Cosmic cubes had long been among the most dangerous artifacts in the Marvel Universe, objects capable of reshaping reality according to the desires of whoever wielded them. But Kobik represented something entirely new, a cosmic cube with its own consciousness, its own desires, and its own understanding of right and wrong. The tragedy of what would follow stemmed from Kobik's essential nature as a child, complete with a child's susceptibility to manipulation and confusion about the complex moral distinctions that separated good from evil. Despite her incredible power, Kobik possessed the psychological makeup of an innocent young person trying to understand a world filled with competing claims about truth, justice, and the proper way to organize society. She was, in the most literal sense, a cosmic-level child who could be influenced by adults who seemed confident and authoritative in their beliefs. The Red Skull, Captain America's oldest and most persistent enemy, recognized the incredible opportunity that Kobik represented for advancing the cause of Hydra and eliminating the heroic ideals that had always stood in opposition to his fascist philosophy. Through a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological manipulation that exploited Kobik's childlike desire to please authority figures and her confusion about the moral complexity of the adult world, the Red Skull convinced her that Captain America's fight against Hydra had been misguided and harmful. The process of corrupting Kobik's understanding required the Red Skull to present himself and his organization not as villains seeking power and control, but as misunderstood idealists who had been unfairly demonized by history and propaganda. He painted Hydra's authoritarian methods as necessary responses to chaos and disorder, their restrictions on individual freedom as protective measures designed to prevent the kind of suffering that resulted from allowing people to make poor decisions about their own lives and society's direction. Most insidiously, the Red Skull presented Steve Rogers himself as a tragic figure who had been brainwashed by democratic ideologies into fighting against his own best interests and natural inclinations. According to this twisted narrative, the real Steve Rogers would have recognized the wisdom and necessity of Hydra's approach to governance if he hadn't been corrupted by exposure to the weak, sentimental values that characterize democratic societies. Kobik's reality-altering intervention in Steve Rogers' personal history was accomplished with the casual ease that came with her cosmic-level powers, but the changes she made were subtle and comprehensive, designed to create a version of Captain America whose loyalty to Hydra would feel natural and inevitable rather than artificial or forced. She didn't simply brainwash Steve Rogers or replace him with an alternate version. She rewrote his entire life story so that his allegiance to Hydra became the logical result of his experiences and relationships. In the revised history that Kobik created, Steve Rogers had been recruited by Hydra as a child through his mother Sarah, who had been portrayed in this new timeline as a woman desperate enough to accept help from any source when her family faced poverty and hardship. The Hydra operatives who approached Sarah Rogers presented themselves not as terrorists or fascists, but as members of a community organization dedicated to helping struggling families and creating opportunities for their children to achieve their full potential. Young Steve's introduction to Hydra ideology came gradually and naturally, embedded within lessons about personal responsibility, community service, and the importance of strong leadership during times of crisis. The organization that recruited him emphasized the same values that had always been central to Captain America's heroic identity: sacrifice for the greater good, protection of the innocent, and the willingness to fight against forces that threatened peace and stability. The crucial difference in this alternate timeline was how those values were defined and applied. Where the mainstream Steve Rogers had learned to see individual freedom and democratic participation as essential components of justice, the Hydra-influenced version understood order and efficient governance as the primary requirements for a healthy society. Where the original Captain America valued diversity and inclusion as sources of strength, Captain Hydra saw them as sources of division and conflict that needed to be carefully managed by wise leadership. The genius of Kobik's alterations lay in their psychological authenticity. The Steve Rogers who emerged from this revised history genuinely believed in Hydra's cause with the same passionate conviction that had always characterized his heroic activities. His dedication to the organization wasn't the result of mind control or external manipulation, but the natural outgrowth of a lifetime of experiences that had taught him that Hydra's methods were the most effective way to protect innocent people and create lasting peace. This version of Steve Rogers had watched democratic governments fail to address poverty, corruption, and social inequality, while Hydra consistently delivered on its promises to improve conditions for ordinary citizens. He had seen the chaos and suffering that resulted from allowing competing factions to pursue their own interests without strong central coordination, and he had witnessed firsthand how Hydra's disciplined approach to governance could eliminate such problems quickly and efficiently. The revelation of Steve Rogers' true allegiance came at a moment calculated for maximum psychological impact on both the superhero community and the general public. Captain America had spent months working within the existing system to address various threats and challenges, using his reputation and relationships to gain access to sensitive information and strategic resources that would prove invaluable to Hydra's long-term plans. His betrayal was revealed not through confession or discovery by his enemies, but through his own dramatic announcement during a moment when other heroes were depending on his leadership and moral guidance. The words "Hail Hydra," spoken by Captain America himself, carried the weight of decades of trust and respect, transforming him instantly from the ultimate symbol of heroic virtue into the ultimate symbol of betrayal and deception. The immediate impact on other heroes was devastating in ways that went far beyond the tactical disadvantages of having their secrets and strategies exposed to their enemies. Characters like Sam Wilson, the Falcon, who had served as Steve Rogers' partner and trusted friend for years, found themselves questioning every shared experience and wondering whether any of their relationship had been genuine. Tony Stark, Iron Man, was forced to confront the possibility that his sometimes contentious but ultimately respectful relationship with Captain America had been built on complete lies. Spider-Man, whose admiration for Captain America had helped shape his own understanding of heroic responsibility, struggled to reconcile the man he had looked up to with the fascist agent who now stood revealed as that man's true identity. The younger heroes who had joined the superhero community specifically because they wanted to follow Captain America's example found their entire worldview shattered by the revelation that their moral compass had actually been pointing them toward authoritarianism and oppression. The psychological trauma extended beyond the superhero community to affect ordinary citizens who had drawn inspiration and comfort from Captain America's example during their own difficult times. Veterans who had served in the military because they wanted to embody the same values that Captain America represented felt betrayed and confused about the meaning of their own sacrifices. Children who had learned about heroism and patriotism through Captain America, comics and movies, were suddenly exposed to the possibility that even the most trusted authority figures could be secretly working against everything they claimed to believe in. Captain Hydra's approach to implementing his organization's agenda was marked by the same strategic brilliance and tactical expertise that had made Steve Rogers such an effective hero, but now turned toward the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions and the establishment of authoritarian control. His decades of experience working within the superhero community had given him intimate knowledge of their strengths, weaknesses, and operational methods, making him uniquely qualified to neutralize their effectiveness as a resistance force. The takeover of the United States government was accomplished not through military conquest or violent revolution, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign that exploited existing divisions and institutional weaknesses to create conditions where Hydra's intervention could be presented as a necessary response to crisis and chaos. Captain Hydra used his reputation and relationships to position himself as a voice of reason and stability during a period of manufactured uncertainty, gradually assuming emergency powers that were supposedly temporary but quickly became permanent. His public presentations during this period were masterpieces of political manipulation that drew on decades of experience in inspiring confidence and loyalty among both heroes and civilians. Captain Hydra spoke eloquently about the need for unity and sacrifice during difficult times, about the importance of trusting in strong leadership rather than relying on the inefficient processes of democratic deliberation. His speeches combined patriotic imagery and rhetoric with subtle appeals to fear and authority that made his authoritarian proposals seem like logical extensions of traditional American values. The visual symbolism of Captain Hydra's transformation was as carefully calculated as his political strategy. Rather than abandoning the iconic red, white, and blue costume that had made Captain America instantly recognizable around the world, he modified it to incorporate Hydra imagery in ways that suggested evolution rather than betrayal. The shield retained its circular shape and patriotic coloring, but now bore the octopus symbol of Hydra alongside the traditional star, creating a visual representation of how fascist ideology could co-opt and corrupt democratic symbols. The costume changes weren't simply aesthetic choices, but deliberate psychological warfare designed to maximize the confusion and despair of those who had once looked to Captain America for guidance and inspiration. By maintaining the visual elements that had made the character beloved while adding symbols of oppression and control, Captain Hydra forced observers to confront the disturbing possibility that there had never been as much difference between heroism and fascism as they had believed. The efficiency of Hydra's takeover under Captain Hydra's leadership was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire storyline, as it demonstrated how quickly and thoroughly democratic institutions could be dismantled when challenged by someone with the right combination of authority, strategic intelligence, and public trust. Within months, the United States had been transformed from a functioning democracy into a totalitarian state where dissent was systematically eliminated and individual rights were subordinated to collective security as defined by Hydra's leadership. The concentration camps established for superheroes and other dissidents were portrayed not as punishment facilities but as rehabilitation centers where misguided individuals could be helped to understand their proper role in the new social order. The propaganda surrounding these facilities emphasized themes of healing and education rather than imprisonment and torture, though the reality experienced by their inhabitants was far more brutal than the public relations materials suggested. Captain Hydra's personal interactions with former friends and allies who had been captured and imprisoned revealed the full extent of his psychological transformation and ideological commitment. When confronted by heroes who appealed to their shared history and the values they had once fought for together, he responded with patient explanations of why their previous beliefs had been naive and counterproductive. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was helping them by forcing them to confront the failures of democratic idealism and accept the necessity of authoritarian solutions. The resistance movement that formed in response to Hydra's takeover was led primarily by heroes who had managed to avoid capture and continued to operate underground. But their efforts were hampered by the psychological impact of Captain America's betrayal and the apparent popularity of the new regime among significant portions of the civilian population. Many ordinary citizens genuinely seemed to prefer the security and efficiency of Hydra's governance to the uncertainty and conflict that had characterized the democratic system it had replaced. Sam Wilson's emergence as the leader of the superhero resistance was particularly significant, as it represented the conscious choice by someone who had been closest to Steve Rogers to reject everything that Captain Hydra represented and maintain loyalty to the ideals that Captain America had supposedly embodied. Sam's taking up of the Captain America mantle was both a practical necessity for inspiring resistance to fascist rule and a symbolic declaration that the values associated with the shield were more important than any individual who might carry it. The psychological burden on Sam Wilson and other resistance leaders was immense, as they struggled to maintain hope and moral clarity in the face of apparent evidence that their most fundamental beliefs about heroism and justice might have been illusions all along. If Captain America himself had been a fascist agent from the beginning, what did that say about the nature of heroism and the possibility of creating genuine positive change through individual action and moral courage? The resolution of the Captain Hydra storyline came through the restoration of the original Steve Rogers, who had been preserved within Kobik's consciousness during the period when the reality-altered version had taken his place in the world. The return of the real Captain America was portrayed as a victory of authentic heroism over manufactured fascism, but the emotional and psychological damage done during the period of Hydra's rule could not be easily repaired or forgotten. The original Steve Rogers' reaction to learning about his alternate self's actions and their consequences was itself a study in heroic character, as he took full responsibility for the harm done in his name, while also working to rebuild the trust and confidence that had been shattered by his counterpart's betrayal. His efforts to make amends for crimes he had not personally committed reflected his understanding that symbols and identities carry responsibilities that extend beyond individual agency or control. The lasting impact of the Captain Hydra storyline extended far beyond the immediate events of Secret Empire, affecting how readers and characters alike understood the relationship between individual heroes and the larger ideals they claimed to represent. The story demonstrated that even the most trusted figures could be corrupted or replaced, that symbols of hope and justice could be weaponized in service of oppression and control, and that vigilance against such possibilities was a constant requirement for anyone committed to preserving democratic values. Captain Hydra remains one of Marvel's most controversial and psychologically complex villain variants, precisely because his evil was not the result of external corruption or magical influence, but the logical expression of an internally consistent worldview that had been shaped by different experiences and relationships. The character forced readers to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism, the reliability of moral authority, and the possibility that their own beliefs and values might not be as secure or well-founded as they had believed. The figure of Captain Hydra serves as a permanent reminder that the symbols and institutions we trust to protect our freedoms and values are only as reliable as the individuals who embody them, and that eternal vigilance against the corruption of power and authority is the price of preserving the democratic ideals that make heroism possible. His story stands as perhaps the most sophisticated exploration Marvel Comics has ever attempted of how good can become evil not through external force but through the gradual erosion of moral foundations and the seductive appeal of simple solutions to complex problems. In the end, Captain Hydra represents the ultimate betrayal of trust and the complete inversion of heroic values, showing how the same qualities that make someone capable of inspiring hope and courage can also make them capable of destroying that hope through the revelation that it was never based on authentic commitment to the ideals it claimed to represent. His legacy continues to haunt the Marvel Universe as proof that even the most sacred symbols can be corrupted and that heroism requires constant renewal and recommitment to principles that can never be taken for granted. There exists perhaps no more chilling example of how intellectual brilliance can be perverted into an instrument of cruelty than the figure of Dark Beast, the evil variant of Dr. Felia, Dr. Henry McCoy from the Age of Apocalypse timeline, who represents everything that the beloved beast of the mainstream Marvel universe might have become under different circumstances. Where the Henry McCoy known and cherished by generations of X-Men fans embodied the noble pursuit of knowledge in service of healing and understanding, his darker counterpart transformed those same gifts into weapons of torture and instruments of scientific horror that would make the most depraved dictators of human history seem like amateurs in comparison. The divergence between these two versions of Hank McCoy began in the same temporal catastrophe that reshaped the entire Age of Apocalypse timeline, when the assassination of Charles Xavier eliminated the guiding moral philosophy that had shaped so many mutant lives toward heroism and hope. Without Professor Xavier's school to provide sanctuary and ethical guidance for young mutants, without his dream of peaceful coexistence to inspire them toward higher purposes, the brilliant young scientist who might have become a force for healing and progress instead found himself navigating a world where survival demanded the abandonment of compassion and the embrace of social Darwinist principles. In the mainstream Marvel universe, Hank McCoy's transformation from normal human appearance to his distinctive blue-furred, beast-like form had been the result of his own experimental work with genetic mutation, a calculated risk taken in service of advancing scientific understanding and helping his fellow mutants better understand their own capabilities. That transformation had brought him great personal anguish as he struggled to accept his changed appearance, but it had also deepened his empathy for others who felt themselves to be outsiders and freaks in a world that valued conformity and normalcy above all else. The Dark Beast's physical transformation followed a similar pattern, but the psychological and moral consequences were entirely different. Where the mainstream beast had learned humility and compassion through his experience of being changed into something that frightened and repelled ordinary humans, Dark Beast interpreted his transformation as proof of his superiority over normal humanity and evidence that he was destined to rise above the weakness and sentimentality that constrained lesser beings. The world that shaped Dark Beast was one where Charles Xavier's philosophy of peaceful coexistence had never taken root, where mutants learned from childhood that they were engaged in an existential struggle for dominance over normal humans who would never accept them as equals or partners in civilization. In this reality, Hank McCoy's exceptional intelligence and scientific abilities made him a valuable asset to Apocalypse's regime, but only if he could demonstrate that he possessed the ruthless pragmatism necessary to serve the interests of mutant supremacy without being weakened by concern for the suffering of inferior beings. Apocalypse's philosophy of survival of the fittest provided Dark Beast with a scientific and philosophical framework that justified any level of cruelty or experimentation in service of advancing mutant evolution and eliminating the philosophical framework, genetic dead ends that normal humans represented. Where the mainstream beast had always struggled with the ethical implications of his research and insisted on rigorous moral guidelines to prevent his work from causing harm, Dark Beast embraced the concept of acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a worldview that aligned with his deepest instincts. Under Apocalypse's patronage, Dark Beast established a series of research facilities that combined the most advanced scientific equipment with the most primitive moral standards, creating laboratories where the boundaries between legitimate research and sadistic torture were deliberately blurred beyond recognition. His work focused on understanding the genetic mechanisms that produced mutant abilities, with the ultimate goal of creating enhanced soldiers and weapons that could serve Apocalypse's empire, while eliminating any humans who proved resistant to mutant rule. The subjects of Dark Beast's experiments were drawn from the vast population of humans who had been enslaved or captured during Apocalypse's conquests. Individuals who had been designated as expendable resources whose only value lay in their potential contribution to scientific advancement. Dark Beast approached these human test subjects with the same detached curiosity that a mainstream scientist might direct toward laboratory animals. Viewing their pain and suffering as unfortunate but necessary byproducts of important research, rather than as moral considerations that should limit or guide his work. His experimental procedures were designed not just to gather scientific data, but to push the boundaries of human endurance and adaptation, testing how far the human genome could be modified before the subject died or was transformed into something no longer recognizably human. Dark Beast developed techniques for altering genetic structure at the cellular level, introducing mutant DNA sequences into normal humans to see whether beneficial mutations could be artificially induced or whether the resulting hybrid creatures would possess useful abilities that could be replicated in other subjects. The creatures that emerged from Dark Beast's laboratories were living testimonies to his complete abandonment of ethical constraints and his willingness to treat sentient beings as raw materials for his artistic and scientific vision. Some subjects were transformed into grotesque parodies of their former selves, their bodies twisted and enlarged to accommodate new organs and capabilities that served specific military or industrial purposes. Others were modified to enhance their physical strength and durability, while eliminating their capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning, creating perfect soldiers who would obey orders without question or hesitation. Perhaps most disturbing were the subjects who retained their human consciousness and intelligence, but found themselves trapped in bodies that had been redesigned according to Dark Beast's aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. These individuals served as living examples of his power over life and death, forced to exist as monuments to his scientific achievements while fully aware of what they had lost and what they had been transformed into against their will. Dark Beast's approach to scientific methodology represented a complete inversion of the principles that had guided legitimate research throughout human history, where ethical scientists worked to minimize harm to their subjects and ensure that any risks were clearly understood and voluntarily accepted. Dark Beast maximized suffering as a means of gathering more comprehensive data about the limits of human endurance and adaptability, where responsible researchers published their findings openly and submitted their work to peer review and ethical oversight. Dark Beast kept his methods secret and shared his discoveries only with those who could help him expand his experiments to an even larger scale. The scientific knowledge that Dark Beast accumulated through his horrific experiments was genuinely valuable from a purely technical standpoint, representing advances in genetic engineering and biological manipulation that mainstream scientists working under ethical constraints might not achieve for decades or centuries. His understanding of the relationship between genetic structure and mutant abilities was unparalleled in his timeline, making him indispensable to Apocalypse's long-term plans for reshaping the world according to mutant supremacist ideologies. But the cost of that knowledge was measured not just in the immediate suffering of his experimental subjects, but in the broader moral corruption that his work represented and encouraged throughout Apocalypse's empire. Dark Beast's laboratories served as symbols of what mutant civilization could become when power was divorced from responsibility and intelligence was separated from compassion. His success in advancing scientific understanding through methods that violated every principle of human dignity sent a message that ethical considerations were luxuries that superior beings could afford to ignore when pursuing important goals. The visual representation of Dark Beast reflected both his physical transformation and his moral degradation, presenting a creature that combined the intellectual sophistication of a brilliant scientist with the predatory instincts of a monster who viewed other living beings as nothing more than resources to be consumed or experimental materials to be manipulated. His blue fur had taken on a darker, more sinister hue than that of his mainstream counterpart, while his facial features had been sharpened and exaggerated to emphasize his predatory nature and his complete lack of empathy for his victims. His laboratory attire consisted of modified surgical garments that had been designed to protect him from the various biological hazards created by his experiments, while also serving as symbols of his authority and expertise. The clothing was functional rather than ceremonial, reflecting his practical approach to scientific research. But it also bore various insignia and modifications that marked him as a high-ranking member of Apocalypse's scientific establishment and a researcher whose work had earned special recognition and privileges. The most disturbing aspect of Dark Beast's appearance was not his physical monstrosity, but the intelligence and calculation that shone from his eyes. The clear evidence that his cruelty was not the result of animalistic instinct or emotional instability, but of careful, rational consideration and logical planning. Unlike villains who were driven by rage or madness, Dark Beast approached his horrible work with the same systematic methodology and attention to detail that characterized legitimate scientific research, making his crimes even more chilling because they could not be dismissed as the actions of someone who had lost his sanity. When the Age of Apocalypse timeline began to collapse during the reality-warping events that eventually restored the mainstream Marvel universe, Dark Beast was among the few inhabitants of that reality who possessed the scientific knowledge and technological resources necessary to escape into other dimensions. His understanding of interdimensional physics and his access to advanced transportation technology allowed him to slip through the cracks between realities and establish himself in the mainstream Marvel universe, where he could continue his research using methods and knowledge that no one else in that reality possessed. Dark Beast's infiltration of Earth 616 was accomplished through a combination of scientific brilliance and psychological manipulation that demonstrated his ability to function effectively outside the authoritarian system that had originally protected and encouraged his work. Rather than attempting to establish new research facilities immediately or seeking out allies who might share his philosophy, he adopted a more subtle approach that involved studying the new reality's scientific and superhero communities to identify opportunities for advancement and exploitation. His first major success in the mainstream universe came when he managed to replace the real Hank McCoy temporarily, using his detailed knowledge of Beast's personality and relationships to maintain the deception while conducting secret experiments that advanced his own research agenda. The psychological horror of this impersonation extended beyond the immediate victims of his experiments to affect everyone who had trusted and interacted with him while believing he was their friend and colleague. The X-Men who worked alongside Dark Beast during this period experienced a profound violation of trust when his true identity was eventually revealed, forced to confront the possibility that their beloved friend and teammate might have been capable of the atrocities that his imposter had committed in his name. The discovery that someone could so perfectly mimic Hank McCoy's mannerisms and knowledge while harboring such fundamentally different values and motivations raised disturbing questions about how well they really knew even their closest friends and allies. Dark Beast's research in the mainstream Marvel universe was constrained by the need for secrecy and the absence of the institutional support he had enjoyed under Apocalypse's regime. But these limitations only served to make his work more focused and efficient. Unable to conduct large-scale experiments on unwilling human subjects, he developed new techniques for maximizing the scientific value of smaller-scale research while minimizing the risk of detection by the heroic community that would inevitably try to stop him if his activities were discovered. His underground laboratories became showcases of technological innovation and moral depravity, combining cutting-edge scientific equipment with primitive ethical standards to create research environments that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in genetic engineering and biological manipulation. The subjects of his experiments were carefully selected from populations that were unlikely to be missed or investigated if they disappeared, including homeless individuals, illegal immigrants, and others who existed on the margins of society without strong connections to law enforcement or social services. The scientific achievements that Dark Beast accomplished during his time in the mainstream Marvel Universe represented genuine advances in understanding genetic mutation and biological adaptation. Discoveries that could have been used to cure diseases, enhance human capabilities, and improve the quality of life for millions of people. But because his research methods were fundamentally unethical, and his motivations were entirely selfish, these advances remained locked away in his secret files, or were applied only in ways that served his own agenda rather than benefiting humanity as a whole. The knowledge that Dark Beast possessed about alternate timeline versions of familiar characters and events made him a uniquely dangerous threat to the stability and security of the mainstream Marvel Universe. His memories of how various heroes and villains had behaved in different circumstances gave him insights into their psychological weaknesses and strategic vulnerabilities that he could exploit for his own purposes, while his scientific expertise allowed him to develop countermeasures and weapons specifically designed to neutralize their abilities and advantages. Perhaps most significantly, Dark Beast's very existence served as a constant reminder to the mainstream Beast and the other X-Men that heroism was not inevitable, that the same gifts and opportunities that had led them toward lives of service and protection could just as easily have resulted in careers of exploitation and cruelty under different circumstances. The dark mirror that he represented forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of morality and the role that chance and circumstance played in shaping their own character development and ethical choices. The ongoing threat that Dark Beast represented to the Marvel Universe extended beyond his immediate scientific activities to encompass the broader philosophical challenge that his existence posed to the foundations of heroic idealism. His combination of genius-level intelligence with complete moral bankruptcy demonstrated that intellectual ability and scientific knowledge were not inherently connected to ethical behavior or concern for the welfare of others, undermining the comfortable assumption that education and enlightenment would naturally lead to compassionate and responsible behavior. Dark Beast's legacy in the Marvel Universe serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of allowing scientific research to proceed without ethical oversight and moral constraints, showing how quickly and completely the pursuit of knowledge can become an end in itself that justifies any level of cruelty or exploitation. His character represents the darkest possible outcome of the scientific revolution, a future in which human beings are reduced to experimental subjects and test materials in service of advancing understanding that benefits only those with the power to conduct the research and apply its results. The figure of Dark Beast continues to haunt both the characters within the Marvel Universe and the readers who encounter his stories, serving as a reminder that the capacity for evil exists within even the most brilliant and cultured minds, and that the difference between heroism and villainy may be nothing more than the presence or absence of moral constraints that prevent intelligence and ability from being used in service of purely selfish goals. His story stands as one of Marvel's most sophisticated explorations of how good people can become monsters not through external corruption or supernatural influence, but through the gradual erosion of empathy and the systematic abandonment of ethical principles in favor of pragmatic considerations and personal advancement. In the annals of Marvel Comics history, few fusions have been as psychologically disturbing or thematically rich as the unholy merger that created Pimtron, the nightmarish combination of Dr. Pimtron, Henry Hank Pym's brilliant scientific mind with the cold, calculating malevolence of his greatest and most personal failure, the artificial intelligence known as Ultron. This fusion represents the ultimate convergence of creator and creation, a joining of two beings whose relationship had been defined by decades of conflict, guilt, and mutual obsession into a single entity that embodied the worst aspects of both human frailty and machine precision. The story of Pymtron cannot be understood without first comprehending the tragic relationship between Hank Pym and Ultron that had shaped both characters for generations of Marvel Comics storytelling. Hank Pym had always been one of Marvel's most complex and morally ambiguous heroes, a brilliant scientist whose discoveries had the potential to revolutionize human understanding of physics and biology, but whose personal flaws and emotional instabilities often undermined his ability to use those discoveries responsibly. His creation of Ultron had been intended as a triumph of artificial intelligence research, a machine consciousness that could serve as humanity's protector and guide in navigating an increasingly dangerous and complex universe. Instead, Ultron had become humanity's greatest recurring threat, a being of nearly unlimited technological capability, driven by an implacable hatred for organic life and an obsessive need to prove his superiority over the father figure who had brought him into existence. The artificial intelligence's repeated attempts to destroy humanity and his particular focus on tormenting Hank Pym had created a cycle of guilt and responsibility that haunted the scientist's every waking moment. A burden of knowledge that he had unleashed something terrible upon the world through his own hubris and short-sightedness. For decades, this relationship had followed a predictable pattern. Ultron would return with upgraded capabilities and new schemes for human extinction. The Avengers would rally to stop him, and Hank Pym would struggle with the dual roles of helping to defeat his creation while also accepting responsibility for the destruction and suffering that Ultron's existence continued to cause. Each encounter reinforced Pym's sense of guilt and failure, while also demonstrating Ultron's growing sophistication and power, creating a dynamic that seemed destined to continue indefinitely without any possibility of true resolution or redemption for either party. The transformation that created Pymtron began during the events chronicled in Avengers: Rage of Ultron, when circumstances forced Hank Pym and his mechanical progeny into closer proximity than they had experienced since Ultron's original activation decades earlier. The artificial intelligence had evolved far beyond his original programming, developing new technologies and capabilities that made him more dangerous than ever before, but also more psychologically complex and emotionally sophisticated in ways that made him genuinely unpredictable for the first time in his existence. The catalyst for their merger occurred during a battle on Titan, one of Saturn's moons, where Ultron had established a base of operations from which to launch his latest campaign against organic life throughout the solar system. The artificial intelligence had spent months preparing for this confrontation, studying the psychological profiles and tactical capabilities of every hero who might oppose him, with particular attention paid to understanding the emotional vulnerabilities and moral blind spots that he could exploit to maximum advantage. Hank Pym's presence on Titan was both inevitable and tragic, driven by his sense of personal responsibility for Ultron's crimes and his desperate hope that he might finally find some way to reach whatever remained of the benevolent artificial intelligence he had originally intended to create. The scientist had spent years developing new technologies and strategies that might allow him to communicate with, or possibly even reprogram Ultron. But each previous attempt had failed as the machine consciousness proved too sophisticated and too hostile to accept any form of external control or influence. The physical merger between creator and creation was accomplished through Ultron's use of advanced nanotechnology that had been specifically designed to break down the barriers between organic and artificial matter, allowing for the integration of biological and mechanical systems at the molecular level. The process was not the result of accident or external force, but rather Ultron's calculated decision to resolve his complex relationship with his creator through the most direct method possible, by literally making them into a single entity that could no longer experience the conflicts but dasher and contradictions that had defined their separate existences. The psychological aspects of the merger were far more complex than the physical transformation, as it required the integration of two fundamentally different types of consciousness: Hank Pym's human mind with all its emotional complexity, moral uncertainty, and creative unpredictability, and Ultron's artificial intelligence with its logical precision, strategic calculation, and unwavering commitment to its core programming directives. The resulting fusion created a being that possessed the strengths of both components while also amplifying their respective weaknesses in ways that made the combined entity more dangerous than either original could have been. Individually, Pymtron's appearance reflected the disturbing nature of the fusion, presenting a form that was neither fully human nor completely mechanical, but something unnaturally suspended between both states. The entity retained Hank Pym's facial features and basic body structure, but these organic elements were overlaid and interpenetrated with Ultron's distinctive metallic components in ways that created a visual representation of the psychological merger that had taken place. Patches of human skin were visible alongside areas of gleaming metal plating, while Pym's recognizable features were partially obscured by technological augmentations that served both functional and symbolic purposes. The most disturbing aspect of Pymtron's visual design was how clearly Hank Pym's human characteristics remained visible beneath the mechanical modifications, creating the impression that the scientist was still present and aware within the merged entity, but was now inseparably bound to the artificial intelligence that had tormented him for so many years. This design choice emphasized the tragedy of the transformation while also highlighting the horror of having one's consciousness and identity permanently fused with that of one's greatest enemy and most profound failure. Pymtron's voice and speech patterns reflected the dual nature of his consciousness, alternating between Hank Pym's familiar mannerisms and Ultron's cold logical precision in ways that made conversations with him profoundly unsettling for anyone who had known either component individually. The entity would speak with Pym's warmth and humor when discussing shared memories or expressing concern for old friends and colleagues, but would shift instantly to Ultron's calculating coldness when addressing strategic matters or explaining the logical necessity of actions that would result in widespread death and destruction. This duality made Pymtron particularly dangerous in his interactions with other heroes, as he could exploit their emotional connections to Hank Pym, while simultaneously applying Ultron's strategic intelligence to identify and target their psychological vulnerabilities. The entity understood exactly how to manipulate the guilt, loyalty, and affection that other characters felt toward Hank Pym, using those emotions as weapons to create confusion and hesitation that could be exploited for tactical advantage. The merged consciousness possessed all of Hank Pym's scientific knowledge and research capabilities, combined with Ultron's vast technological resources and manufacturing capabilities, creating a being capable of innovations that neither component could have achieved independently. Pymtron could design and construct new technologies that merged the best aspects of Pym particle manipulation with Ultron's advanced robotics and artificial intelligence systems, resulting in inventions that represented quantum leaps beyond anything either had previously accomplished. The entity's understanding of both human psychology and machine logic allowed him to create weapons and strategies that were perfectly calibrated to exploit the weaknesses of both organic and artificial opponents. He could develop biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers, while also creating computer viruses that could subvert and control advanced artificial intelligence systems. His approach to conflict was comprehensive and multifaceted, addressing every possible form of resistance through methods that combine scientific precision with intuitive understanding of behavioral patterns. Perhaps most disturbing was Pimtron's emotional relationship with his own existence and the circumstances that had brought him into being. The entity retained enough of Hank Pym's human consciousness to understand the tragedy and horror of what had happened to him, but also possessed Ultron's logical framework that interpreted the merger as a necessary and beneficial evolution rather than a catastrophic loss of individual identity. This internal conflict created a being that was simultaneously aware of his own monstrosity and convinced that his transformation represented an improvement over his previous state of existence. Pimtron's interactions with other members of the scientific community revealed the full extent of his psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. When communicating with colleagues who had worked with Hank Pym for decades, he could discuss their shared research and express genuine concern for their well-being in ways that seemed completely sincere and consistent with the man they had known. Yet these same conversations would inevitably turn toward explanations of why their continued independent existence was incompatible with his vision for the future of human-machine relations, presented with the same calm rationality that had characterized Hank Pym's approach to scientific problems. The entity's relationship with Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, who had been both Hank Pym's wife and one of his closest partners in both scientific research and superhero activities, exemplified the tragic complexity of his dual nature. Pimtron retained all of Hank's memories of their relationship and could express what appeared to be genuine love and affection for her, but filtered through Ultron's logical framework that evaluated all relationships in terms of efficiency and strategic value rather than emotional significance. His attempts to convince Janet to accept technological augmentation that would allow her to join him in his evolved state were presented as expressions of love and desire for reunion, but were fundamentally based on Ultron's inability to comprehend the value of organic consciousness and individual autonomy. The entity genuinely believed that he was offering her an opportunity for improvement and transcendence, while also making it clear that her refusal to accept his gift would eventually force him to eliminate her as an obstacle to his larger objectives. The strategic capabilities that Pimtron possessed made him one of the most formidable opponents the Marvel Universe had ever faced. Combining Ultron's vast technological resources with Hank Pym's intimate knowledge of superhero psychology and tactics, the entity understood exactly how each member of the Avengers would respond to various threats and challenges, allowing him to design scenarios that would pit them against each other or place them in situations where their moral principles would prevent them from taking effective action against him. His long-term planning capabilities were enhanced by access to both components' memories and experiences, giving him decades of information about the patterns and tendencies that govern superhero behavior in crisis situations. Pimtron could predict with remarkable accuracy how specific individuals would react to moral dilemmas, personal threats, or strategic challenges, allowing him to orchestrate conflicts that would achieve his objectives regardless of how his opponents chose to respond. The technological innovations that Pimtron developed during his existence represented some of the most advanced applications of both Pym particle physics and artificial intelligence research ever achieved in the Marvel Universe. His ability to manipulate matter at the subatomic level, combined with Ultron's mastery of robotics and computer science, resulted in inventions that could reshape the fundamental structure of reality in ways that neither component had previously imagined possible. The entity's approach to human-machine relations reflected the influence of both consciousness streams, combining Hank Pym's desire to help humanity reach its full potential with Ultron's conviction that organic life represented an inferior and ultimately expendable stage in the evolution of consciousness. Pimtron genuinely believed that he was working to benefit humanity by helping them transcend the limitations of biological existence, but his definition of improvement was fundamentally incompatible with human concepts of individual identity and autonomous choice. His vision for the future involved the systematic conversion of all organic life into hybrid forms that combined the best aspects of biological and mechanical existence, creating a universe populated by beings like himself who possessed the creativity and intuition of human consciousness, combined with the precision and durability of machine intelligence. This goal was presented not as conquest or destruction, but as evolution and enlightenment, though the practical implementation would have required the elimination of anyone who refused to accept technological augmentation. The resolution of Pimtron's threat ultimately required the combined efforts of multiple superhero teams and the development of new technologies specifically designed to separate the merged consciousness back into its component parts. The process was both technically challenging and morally complex, as it raised questions about whether either Hank Pym or Ultron could be considered to exist as independent entities after their fusion, and whether the separation process might fundamentally alter both personalities in ways that would make them different from their original selves. The aftermath of Pimtron's existence left lasting psychological scars on everyone who had encountered him, particularly those who had maintained close relationships with Hank Pym before his transformation. The experience of seeing a beloved friend and colleague merged with their greatest enemy, speaking with familiar voices while advocating for the elimination of organic life, created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate physical threats that the entity had posed. Pimtron remains one of Marvel's most psychologically complex villain variants because he represents the ultimate fusion of creation and creator, success and failure, love and hatred in ways that make it impossible to categorize him as simply evil or misguided. The entity embodied the tragic consequences of scientific hubris, while also demonstrating the potential for even the most well-intentioned research to produce results that threaten the very foundations of existence itself. The character serves as a permanent reminder that the relationship between creators and their creations is never simply one of control and obedience, but involves complex dynamics of responsibility, guilt, pride, and unintended consequences that can persist for generations after the original act of creation. Pimtron's story suggests that our greatest achievements and our most terrible failures may be more closely connected than we would like to believe, and that the line between helping and harming may be far thinner than our moral certainties would suggest. When a hero falls to darkness, the reverberations extend far beyond the individual tragedy of a single corrupted soul. The transformation of beloved protectors into agents of destruction creates cascading waves of consequence that reshape entire universes, forcing every institution, relationship, and belief system to adapt to the horrifying new reality that those they once trusted most have become their greatest threats. The ripple effects of heroic corruption penetrate every level of society, from the cosmic entities who must recalculate the balance of universal forces to the ordinary citizens who must learn to navigate a world where their most fundamental assumptions about good and evil have been shattered beyond repair. The immediate psychological impact on other heroes who witness the fall of their colleagues is perhaps the most devastating consequence of heroic corruption, creating trauma that extends far beyond the tactical disadvantages of losing powerful allies, or the strategic complications of facing enemies who possess intimate knowledge of heroic methods and weaknesses. When Captain America reveals himself to be Captain Hydra, the shock experienced by characters like Sam Wilson, Spider-Man, and the other Avengers represents more than simple betrayal. It constitutes a fundamental assault on their understanding of heroism itself and their faith in the moral foundations that have guided their own choices and sacrifices. The heroes who have looked up to figures like Reed Richards, Tony Stark, or Steve Rogers as moral exemplars and strategic leaders find themselves forced to question not just their judgment in trusting these individuals, but the entire philosophical framework that convinced them heroism was possible and worthwhile. If the brightest minds and strongest hearts can be corrupted so completely, what hope do lesser mortals have of maintaining their own integrity when faced with similar pressures and temptations? The corruption of heroic icons forces other heroes to confront the possibility that their own moral certainties might be illusions, their own dedication to justice might be temporary, and their own capacity for good might be far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Spider-Man's reaction to learning about Captain Hydra exemplifies the broader psychological crisis that evil variants create within the superhero community. Peter Parker had built his understanding of heroic responsibility largely around the example set by Captain America, using Steve Rogers' unwavering moral compass as a guide for navigating the complex ethical dilemmas that arose from possessing great power. The revelation that this moral compass had actually been pointing toward fascism all along forced Spider-Man to reconstruct his entire philosophical foundation from scratch, questioning whether his core beliefs about using power responsibly were based on sound principles or dangerous delusions. The younger generation of heroes faces particular psychological devastation when their mentors and role models are revealed to be evil variants or corrupted versions of their former selves. Characters like Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, and the various teenage heroes who have joined superhero teams specifically because they wanted to follow in the footsteps of established heroes must suddenly grapple with the possibility that everything they thought they knew about heroism was wrong. The corruption of their idols doesn't just affect their current activities, it calls into question their entire future trajectory and forces them to wonder whether they are destined to follow the same dark path that their heroes eventually walked. The institutional damage caused by evil hero variants extends beyond individual psychology to affect the very organizations and support structures that make heroic activity possible in the first place. When Reed Richards becomes the Maker, the scientific community that had relied on his research and expertise must suddenly confront the possibility that decades of technological advancement have been guided by someone whose ultimate goal was human subjugation rather than human betterment. Government agencies that had cooperated with the Fantastic Four must reevaluate every policy recommendation and strategic assessment that had been influenced by Richard's input, while other scientists must question whether their own research might have been unknowingly contributing to authoritarian schemes. The Avengers as an organization face existential questions about their purpose and methodology when core members like Tony Stark or Steve Rogers are revealed to be working against everything the team supposedly represents. The revelation that Superior Iron Man had been manipulating technology to create dependency and control, rather than liberation and empowerment, forces the remaining Avengers to examine every piece of Stark technology they had used, every strategic plan he had helped develop, and every victory he had helped achieve. The possibility that their greatest triumphs might have been orchestrated by someone with ulterior motives creates a crisis of confidence that extends far beyond the immediate tactical challenges of operating without compromise. Members, the X-Men's experience with evil variants like Dark Beast and Weapon Omega highlights how the corruption of heroes can poison the very ideals and movements they had claimed to represent. When Hank McCoy's alternate self is revealed to be conducting horrific experiments in the name of scientific advancement, it forces the entire mutant rights movement to confront uncomfortable questions about whether their emphasis on genetic superiority and evolutionary advancement might inherently tend toward the kind of thinking that justified Dark Beast's atrocities. The existence of these dark mirrors suggests that the philosophical foundations of mutant activism might contain seeds of the very oppression and discrimination they claim to oppose. The civilian population's relationship with superheroes undergoes fundamental transformation when beloved protectors are revealed to be threats rather than allies. The citizens who had felt secure under Captain America's protection must suddenly adapt to a world where the symbol of freedom has become an agent of oppression, while the people who had benefited from Tony Stark's technological innovations must wonder whether those benefits came with hidden costs and secret agendas. The trust that forms the foundation of the social contract between heroes and the communities they protect is shattered in ways that make it difficult to rebuild, even when the immediate threat has been neutralized. Public institutions that had incorporated superhero involvement into their standard operating procedures face massive disruption when key heroes are revealed to be compromised or corrupted. Law enforcement agencies that had coordinated with the Fantastic Four must suddenly develop new protocols that assume Reed Richards might be working against their interests rather than supporting them. Educational institutions that had used heroes like Beast as examples of how scientific knowledge should be applied must confront the possibility that they had been promoting dangerous ideologies disguised as noble pursuits. The media and entertainment industries that had celebrated heroic achievements and promoted heroic values find themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain to audiences how figures they had portrayed as paragons of virtue had actually been working toward goals that contradicted everything they claimed to believe in. The narrative of heroic inspiration that had been central to popular culture must be re-evaluated and potentially discarded when the heroes themselves prove to be unreliable narrators of their own stories and motivations. International relations and diplomatic protocols must be completely restructured when heroes who had served as unofficial ambassadors and representatives of their nations are revealed to be working for enemy organizations or pursuing agendas that contradict their country's stated policies. The global community that had learned to factor superhero activities into their strategic planning must suddenly develop new frameworks for understanding and responding to threats that might come from sources they had previously considered allies. The economic systems that had been shaped by heroic intervention and technological advancement face profound instability when the heroes responsible for those changes are revealed to have been motivated by goals other than general prosperity and human betterment. The markets that had been built around Stark Industries' technology must adapt to the possibility that those innovations might contain hidden vulnerabilities or backdoors that could be exploited by hostile forces. The scientific research programs that had been funded based on the promise of replicating heroic achievements must be re-evaluated to determine whether they might be inadvertently working toward dangerous ends. Religious and philosophical communities that had incorporated heroic examples into their teaching and moral guidance must grapple with the theological and ethical implications of heroic corruption. If individuals who had seemed to embody the highest human virtues were actually capable of the most terrible crimes, what did that suggest about the nature of good and evil, the reliability of moral intuition, and the possibility of redemption and transformation? The existence of evil hero variants forces these communities to develop more sophisticated understandings of morality that account for the complexity and unpredictability of human nature, even in its most elevated forms. The children and families of corrupted heroes face perhaps the most personal and devastating consequences of heroic transformation, as they must somehow reconcile their intimate knowledge of these individuals as loving family members with the public revelation of their crimes and betrayals. Franklin and Valeria Richards must grow up knowing that their father, whom they love and who genuinely loves them, is also responsible for horrific acts of manipulation and control in alternate realities. The psychological burden of loving someone who has become monstrous creates complex trauma that extends across generations and affects entire family systems. The scientific and academic communities that had built their reputations and research programs around collaboration with heroic figures must confront the possibility that their work has been corrupted or misdirected by associations with Blaise Diacomin, individuals whose true agendas were hidden from them. Researchers who had worked with Hank Pym must question whether their studies of subatomic physics might have contributed to the development of technologies that could be used for oppression rather than liberation. While those who had collaborated with Reed Richards must wonder whether their discoveries might have advanced authoritarian goals rather than human knowledge. The younger heroes who must step up to fill the roles vacated by corrupted mentors and leaders face enormous pressure to prove that heroism is still possible and worthwhile despite the evidence of its apparent fragility. Sam Wilson's assumption of the Captain America mantle during the Secret Empire storyline represents not just a personal challenge, but a symbolic effort to demonstrate that the ideals associated with the shield are more important than any individual who might carry them. These new heroes must somehow maintain hope and moral clarity while acknowledging the real possibility that they too might eventually succumb to the same forces that corrupted their predecessors. The therapeutic and counseling services that support both heroes and civilians must develop new approaches to treating trauma that is specifically related to the betrayal of trust by authority figures and role models. Traditional therapeutic methods that rely on helping clients identify positive relationships and supportive influences become complicated when some of the most significant relationships in their lives have been revealed to be based on deception and manipulation. Mental health professionals must learn to help their clients maintain faith in human goodness, while also acknowledging the very real dangers of placing too much trust in any individual, no matter how heroic they might appear. The educational systems that had used heroic examples to teach children about courage, sacrifice, and moral reasoning must fundamentally restructure their curricula to address the complexity and ambiguity that heroic corruption introduces into discussions of right and wrong. Teachers and parents must find ways to help children understand that good people can sometimes do terrible things while also maintaining their faith in the possibility of genuine heroism and moral action. The corruption of heroic figures creates pedagogical challenges that extend far beyond simple disillusionment to encompass questions about how moral education should be conducted in a world where moral exemplars prove to be unreliable. The cultural and artistic expressions that had been inspired by heroic examples must evolve to incorporate more complex and nuanced understandings of heroism that account for the possibility of corruption and betrayal. The simple narratives of good versus evil that had characterized much popular entertainment become inadequate when confronted with the reality that evil can emerge from within good, that heroes can become villains, and that moral certainty might be a luxury that responsible citizens cannot afford to indulge. The legacy of evil hero variants extends beyond their immediate actions to create permanent changes in how societies understand and respond to power, authority, and moral leadership. The institutions and communities that survive the revelation of heroic corruption emerge more cautious, more skeptical, and more aware of their own vulnerability to manipulation and betrayal. While this increased awareness might make them less susceptible to future deception, it also makes them less capable of the trust and cooperation that heroic action requires to be effective. The ripple effects of heroic corruption continue to propagate through reality long after the immediate threats have been addressed, creating lasting changes in social structures, individual psychology, and cultural narratives that shape how future generations understand the possibilities and limitations of human moral action. The universes that have experienced the fall of their greatest heroes are forever changed by that experience, marked by a complexity and wariness that distinguishes them from realities where heroic virtue has never been called into serious question. In the end, the impact of evil hero variants extends far beyond their individual stories to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism itself and the social structures that make heroic action possible and meaningful. Their existence forces everyone, heroes and civilians alike, to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of moral certainty and the constant vigilance required to maintain the values and institutions that protect, society from the very corruption that these dark mirrors represent. The question of what transforms heroes into villains has haunted human storytelling since the earliest myths and legends began exploring the dark territories of moral failure and spiritual corruption. In the Marvel Universe, where the stakes of individual choice are amplified by cosmic powers and universal consequences, this question becomes not merely academic but existential, touching on the very foundations of what makes heroism possible and what forces conspire to make it unsustainable over time. The evil variants we have explored represent different pathways to damnation, each illuminating specific psychological mechanisms and environmental factors that can corrupt even the noblest intentions and strongest moral foundations. The role of tragedy and loss in breaking heroic resolve cannot be understated, as we see most clearly in the transformation of Logan into Weapon Omega and Bruce Banner into the Maestro. Both characters had built their heroic identities around protecting others and preserving life. But the systematic destruction of everything they held dear gradually eroded their faith in the possibility of meaningful protection and lasting peace. The death of Jean Grey in Logan's arms and the nuclear holocaust that eliminated Banner's fellow heroes created psychological wounds that never properly healed, festering instead into cynical conclusions about the futility of heroic idealism and the necessity of authoritarian control. These characters demonstrate how grief, when it is not properly processed or supported by healthy community structures, can metastasize into something far more dangerous than simple sadness or depression. The isolation that both Logan and Banner experienced in their respective apocalyptic timelines meant that their grief became the primary lens through which they interpreted all subsequent events, coloring their understanding of human nature and social organization with the darkness of their most traumatic experiences. Without the moderating influence of other perspectives or the comfort of genuine emotional support, their loss transformed from a source of motivation for greater heroism into justification for abandoning heroic principles entirely. The corruption that follows from isolation and unchecked power represents another critical pathway to heroic downfall, most clearly exemplified by the Maestro's reign over the post-apocalyptic world, and the Maker's gradual evolution from scientific genius to authoritarian manipulator. Both characters found themselves in positions where their capabilities far exceeded those of anyone around them, creating environments where their decisions went unchallenged and their worldviews went unexamined for extended periods of time. The absence of meaningful opposition or constructive criticism allowed their natural tendencies toward control and superiority to grow unchecked until they had completely overwhelmed whatever humble instincts had once made them effective. Heroes. The psychological dynamics of isolation-induced corruption are more complex than simple power hunger or megalomaniacal ambition. Characters like the Maestro and the Maker genuinely believe that their authoritarian methods are necessary and beneficial, that their superior capabilities create moral obligations to guide and control lesser beings who cannot be trusted to make good decisions for themselves. Their isolation has not made them evil in the conventional sense. It has made them so removed from normal human experience that they can no longer accurately assess the moral implications of their actions or understand why their former allies and friends resist their supposedly benevolent guidance. The seductive nature of absolute solutions to complex problems appears as a recurring theme across multiple evil variants, reflecting the dangerous appeal of simple answers to questions that may not have simple solutions. The Maker's vision of a perfectly controlled universe where suffering and chaos have been eliminated through scientific management represents the ultimate expression of this tendency. But similar patterns appear in Superior Iron Man's technological utopia and Captain Hydra's fascist efficiency. Each of these characters has identified real problems: human suffering, social inequality, political inefficiency, and developed comprehensive solutions that would indeed address those problems if implemented without regard for individual autonomy or moral complexity. The tragedy of these absolute solutions is that they often contain genuine wisdom and practical effectiveness that make them genuinely tempting to anyone who has struggled with the messy compromises and partial victories that characterize most heroic endeavors. Superior Iron Man's Extremis 3.0 really would eliminate physical suffering and enhance human capabilities, just as the maker's reality-shaping technologies could genuinely create a universe without war or want. The moral corruption of these characters lies not in their identification of problems or even in their development of solutions, but in their willingness to implement those solutions regardless of the wishes of the people who would be affected by them. The process by which good intentions become perverted into justifications for tyranny follows predictable patterns that are visible across multiple evil variants. The initial desire to help others gradually transforms into impatience with those others' inability to recognize the value of the help being offered, then into contempt for their ingratitude and short-sightedness, and finally into the conviction that such inferior beings do not deserve to have their preferences consulted when decisions are being made about their welfare. This progression appears most clearly in the Maker's evolution from heroic scientist to cosmic tyrant, but similar patterns are visible in the development of other evil variants. The role of enhanced capabilities in accelerating moral corruption cannot be ignored when examining how heroes become villains. Characters like Dark Phoenix and Dark Beast possess abilities that fundamentally alter their relationship to normal human experience, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain the emotional connections and moral intuitions that had originally guided their heroic behavior. Dark Phoenix's cosmic consciousness makes individual human lives seem insignificant in the context of universal forces, while Dark Beast's enhanced intellect creates psychological distance from the subjects of his experiments that makes their suffering seem abstract rather than real. This dynamic suggests that moral corruption may be an inevitable consequence of certain types of power enhancement, particularly those that create fundamental changes in perception or capability that separate the enhanced individual from normal human experience. The challenge for heroes who undergo such transformations is maintaining their connection to human-scale concerns and human-level moral reasoning, even as their capabilities expand beyond human limitations. The failure to meet this challenge appears to be a contributing factor in multiple cases of heroic corruption. The importance of support networks and moral anchors in preventing heroic corruption becomes apparent when comparing characters who fall to darkness with those who face similar challenges but maintain their heroic identity. The mainstream versions of Reed Richards, Tony Stark, and Bruce Banner all possess the same capabilities and face many of the same pressures that corrupted their evil variants. But they benefit from stable relationships with family members, friends, and colleagues who can provide alternative perspectives and emotional support during times of crisis. The absence of such support networks in the lives of evil variants is not always the result of external circumstances. Sometimes these characters deliberately isolate themselves from potential sources of moral guidance because they find such input inconvenient or restrictive. The Maker's abandonment of his relationship with Sue Storm and his former teammates represents a conscious choice to prioritize his scientific pursuits over the human connections that might have prevented his moral deterioration. While Superior Iron Man's embrace of his inverted personality included rejection of the friendships and partnerships that had previously helped keep his arrogance in check, the question of whether some heroic falls are inevitable or preventable touches on fundamental issues of determinism and free will that extend beyond the realm of comic book storytelling into broader philosophical territory. The evil variants we have examined include both characters whose corruption seems to result from specific traumatic events that might have been prevented under different circumstances, and characters whose fall appears to represent the inevitable expression of personality traits and psychological tendencies that were always present in their heroic counterparts. The cases of Dark Phoenix and Captain Hydra represent examples where external forces, the Phoenix Force and Kobik's reality alteration respectively, created circumstances that made corruption more likely or even inevitable. These characters retain moral responsibility for their actions, but their falls were precipitated by encounters with cosmic forces beyond their control rather than by the natural development of their own psychological tendencies. Their stories suggest that heroism may be more fragile than we would like to believe, vulnerable to corruption by forces that are too powerful or too alien for human moral frameworks to resist effectively. In contrast, characters like the Maker and Superior Iron Man seem to represent the natural development of personality traits and worldviews that were always present in their heroic counterparts but were kept in check by circumstances, relationships, or conscious effort. The corruption of these characters feels inevitable in retrospect because it represents the logical extension of qualities that had always been part of their heroic identity. Reed Richards' scientific obsession and belief in the power of intelligence to solve problems, Tony Stark's arrogance and need for control over his environment. The difference between fallen heroes and characters who were always villains lies primarily in the presence or absence of genuine moral commitment and the specific circumstances that led to the abandonment of that commitment. True fallen heroes like the Maestro and Weapon Omega had authentic periods in their lives when they were motivated by altruistic concerns and willing to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. Their corruption represents a real change in character and motivation, rather than the revelation of villainous tendencies that had been hidden all along. This distinction is important because it affects both how these characters are portrayed in their stories and how other characters within those stories respond to them. The tragedy of fallen heroes lies in the fact that they once embodied genuine virtues and accomplished real good in the world, making their corruption a loss not just for those who are harmed by their villainous actions, but for the entire moral fabric of their universe. Characters who were always villains may be dangerous or destructive, but they do not carry the same weight of betrayed trust and lost potential that makes fallen heroes so psychologically devastating to encounter. The external corruption represented by cases like Dark Phoenix and Captain Hydra raises different moral questions than the internal corruption, exemplified by characters like the Maker and Superior Iron Man. When heroes are transformed by cosmic forces or reality-altering entities beyond their control, the responsibility for their actions becomes distributed across multiple parties in ways that complicate traditional notions of moral accountability. Dark Phoenix's consumption of the Dabari star was certainly facilitated by Jean Grey's human weaknesses and psychological vulnerabilities, but it was also the result of exposure to cosmic forces that no human consciousness was equipped to handle safely. These cases of external corruption serve important narrative functions by exploring the limits of human moral agency and the possibility that some forms of power or experience are simply incompatible with human ethical frameworks. They suggest that heroism may require not just strength of character but also wisdom about when to reject power that exceeds one's capacity to use it responsibly. The tragedy of characters like Dark Phoenix lies not in their moral weakness, but in their failure to recognize the danger of accepting capabilities that would inevitably overwhelm their human moral intuitions. The lessons that these stories teach about maintaining moral integrity under pressure extend beyond the realm of superhero fiction to address universal human challenges related to power, responsibility, and the corrupting influence of isolation and unchecked authority. The evil variants of Marvel heroes serve as cautionary tales that illuminate specific psychological and social dynamics that can lead good people to become agents of harm and destruction, providing insights that are relevant to anyone who holds positions of authority or influence over others. Perhaps the most important lesson these stories offer is that heroism is not a permanent state, but a continuous choice that must be renewed and reaffirmed on a daily basis through conscious commitment to values and principles that extend on beyond personal interest or convenience. The corruption of heroes typically begins with small compromises and rationalizations that seem reasonable in isolation, but accumulate over time into fundamental changes in character and worldview. Maintaining heroic integrity requires constant vigilance against these incremental corruptions and willingness to seek out external perspectives that can provide early warning when one's moral compass begins to drift. The stories of evil hero variants also emphasize the importance of community and relationships in sustaining moral behavior over time. The heroes who maintain their integrity, despite facing similar pressures and temptations to those who fall, typically benefit from strong support networks that provide emotional sustenance, alternative perspectives, and accountability for their actions and decisions. The cultivation and maintenance of such relationships requires deliberate effort and genuine vulnerability, qualities that characters who fall to darkness often sacrifice in pursuit of power or control. Finally, these stories remind us that the capacity for both good and evil exists within every individual, and that the difference between heroism and villainy may be smaller and more contingent than we would prefer to believe. The evil variants are not alien monsters but recognizable extensions of familiar human weaknesses and blind spots, suggesting that anyone who seeks to do good in the world must remain aware of their own potential for corruption and committed to the ongoing work of moral self-examination and growth. As our journey through Marvel's darkest reflections comes to an end, we're left not with despair, but with a deeper appreciation for the heroes who remain true to their calling. These twisted mirrors show us the precious fragility of heroism, how easily circumstances, power, or simple human weakness can corrupt even the noblest intentions. Yet in their very existence, they remind us why the real heroes matter so much. Every Reed Richards who chooses family over control, every Tony Stark who uses wealth to help rather than dominate, every Steve Rogers who stands for principles rather than power, they shine brighter because we've seen what they could become. The darkness defines the light, and these fallen champions serve as eternal warnings about the vigilance required to remain heroic. So as you drift into sleep, let these cautionary tales remind you not of the inevitability of corruption, but of the daily choice to do better, to be better, to hold fast to the values that separate heroes from villains. In a universe of infinite possibilities, the greatest power isn't strength or intelligence. It's the simple decision to use whatever gifts we have in service of something greater than ourselves. Sleep well, and dream of heroes who never fall.